We're live. This is Dark Journalist. It's a fantastic crowd already. And of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And tonight's a very special show as we go deep now on this whole sweep of the deep state lockdown on one hand, but then the larger tools that have been left for us in terms of the Gurdjieff work around the mystery schools for dealing with a world in crisis and human affairs in crisis. That's where we're going tonight with X Series episode 86. We're going to blend the two because there have been so many developments and we've dealt with such a kind of a major shakeup here in the world with this kind of, let's say exceptional,
Right, I'm so sick of the word unprecedented.
No, that is the word that we don't want anymore.
No,
but
exceptional is much better.
Well, what it feels to me is like the ultimate overreach that we're looking at. And what I like about this is that we're kind of realizing with the announcement now from the White House that we're not going to be having the lockdown in perpetuity. This is the first thing, that are going to reopen America in 3 stages, and that some of those states can reopen right now. That's a major, major breakthrough. Just comparatively recently, they were just speaking about keeping this going 18 months, which was the deep state's plan to keep us all in that perpetual shock and to kind of leave us in this state where we just relied on them for everything. And slowly but slowly, all of those rights get encroached upon, and that's the end of the show. So this is a major shakeup and a shakeout, and the fact that Trump was able to follow through with it. You know, some people were saying, well, we shouldn't have these kind of 3 phases of it or what have you. Listen, under the circumstances with what he was working with and the kind of ping pong match that he was in between different forces, it doesn't matter really if you're right or left, or if you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, or if you're libertarian. All those things are great. The bottom line is whoever's on the side of reopening America, that's the right side. Because the whole unconstitutional overreach of keeping people in their homes was, of course, beyond absurd. We're going to get into that tonight as well. One of the things I want to say up front is that in the second half of the program, we're going to be taking your questions live. And Olivia is going to be taking those. You're going to ask them all in caps, and that's going to help us to sort them out. We're going to be doing those on the second part of the program. And because of all of the kind of crazy things that are going on that we're seeing with people getting thrown off social media, and we've been looking at that quite a bit this week, we really now have the opportunity to take this entire scene and move it over to our newsletter. And that's what I would like to see accomplished, so that if and when YouTube decides to get real uppity, everyone will be over there with us on the newsletter. Now that is at darkjournalist.com, which I highly recommend that you go to, and you have a second to go to it right now and sign up for the free newsletter. And basically all that will happen there is that you'll be receiving a newsletter about once a week on Fridays, letting you know what shows are coming up, what guests are coming up. We have amazing guests coming up for April, and some very impressive, important conversations you're going to want to be a part of. So go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. Now, in terms of them sort of turning people off, we've seen them across the board on Twitter in the last week, just throwing people off left and right, which is beyond absurd. You think you have a free society, but then some people go against the grain and say things that are on their mind, and boom, the overseers decide you're out, And
Gigi calls them overlords.
Overlords.
I like that.
Yeah, that's really giving them a lot of credit too. What's amazing, but it's oh so fitting of their own vision of themselves. And it's great to have Dimensions and Beyond out there. I want to say thank you so much. And what's fascinating to me is that when we have this situation, you really are looking at people in situations where the social media companies, the leaders like Jack Dorsey and Zuckerberg over at Facebook, they are so in their own bubble. They are so beholden to certain political interests that we're in a very strange bind where that's supposed to be the open democracy. In the open democracy marketplace, many of the ideas of individuality and sovereignty really stand up very well, as do other ideas of collectivism and all the rest. The narrative that they're looking for is just this one centralized narrative, which they've been pushing. And when you go into those worlds like Netflix and like Twitter, they're very much in their own space. I mean, it's not reality, but they've created this kind of democratic echo chamber. And it's actually the very worst of the Democrats. A normal Democrat would be aghast. So we find the very worst of this kind of weird dystopian freak show right in the heart of Twitter. And so the things that they have trending, are always against, people who are asking questions and all the rest of it, against people that they deem conspiracy theorists and all the rest. That's literally a way of saying we can't deal with the truth because in an open marketplace, if your ideas compete with my ideas and people like your ideas better, it means I've explained them better or there's more facts behind mine. But if you want to just control a narrative and control how people think, like, for example, in relation to COVID-19 and the coronavirus sensation, and if you don't want people to question anything beyond the fact that Bill Gates is going to get you a vaccine and just hunker down in your home for 18 months and watch these celebrities, mourn the loss of their freedom in these huge, sprawling satin sheets. This is the bizarre world that they've tried to very quickly move us into, with the idea, I believe, based on information from people like Catherine Austin Fitts and others, of creating this Internet of Things where we would just plug into a system. That would be it. And that we would basically be kind of, utilized in that system. And it was a big way to kind of move the old world over, get rid of that nasty constitution and bring on the technocratic terror. We've seen quite a bit of that, and we're in the midst of this. Now, you might say, how does that relate to some of the deeper work that we do in this program relating to mystery schools, and in particular, Gurdjieff's Fourth Way? I'm going to explain that tonight because the very heart of the Fourth Way teaching takes place under extreme difficulties. The Russian Revolution, World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. There's always great crisis. And this is where the opportunity exists to actually raise our consciousness quite a bit, to develop a new world, and then taking a look at what that new world would be all about. And it's not really about finding people, as we see so often, whether it's in chat comments or whatever it is, a lot of people looking for a fight. I mean, in fact, they're trying to look for information, but they're so prejudiced for one point of view that there's no flexibility. And so, you run into these people all the time up here in Cambridge, where I live, who just want to see the nanny state take over, and they just want everyone to kind of toe the line for that.
Because they know best.
And you come to expect it around here. It's a liberal bastion, and that's okay. But the problem essentially with it is it becomes a kind of fascism, and you see it in people saying, well, for the contradictions are so vast. For example, there's a big slogan around "keep your laws off my body," which is a big abortion slogan up here. And I could appreciate it. Government shouldn't have their laws on people's bodies. I absolutely agree. Aha, but you ask those same people about this master vaccine that is going to go into everybody's body, supposedly, to cure the world of coronavirus. And suddenly, no, you have no sovereignty over your own body. You have to take that because the government is telling you to. So you see, it's a kind of opposing politicality, opposing of identity. Doesn't actually have any core, because if it did, then it would express, on one hand, this libertarian, keep your laws off my body, would apply to this other situation. But no. So we bring up vaccines too in this sense, which is, there's been this incredible push, as we've demonstrated in the past couple of programs, around Gates and his vaccine, and him as showing up as kind of this medical authority who's going to guide us through it. There's been tremendous pushback on Gates because of his past and his background, and we're going to see how the mainstream media is trying to rescue him and say, like, oh, he's doing all these great things, and what do you mean? And it's quite fascinating to see how money works and how money talks in these environments, and the incredible wealth that can be realized out of this crisis. Now, we've gone to great lengths in the past few shows to demonstrate just how deep those, the kind of sensationalism around this reporting goes. One of the things I want to point out is that we're in a situation where actual information on the ground is very important. So tonight I'm going to give you some information on the ground in relation to the numbers. And we're going to start off with that, but then we're going to get into the larger arc of what's taking place and how knowledge around the mystery schools and how knowledge about the larger picture relating to what's actually going on behind the scenes is going to help us a great deal. And before we do that, I'm going to ask Miss Olivia, how's the temperature out there?
Well, I feel like people are starving. They're hungry out there. They're hungry for truth,
Yes.
for wisdom, for sanity. I do want to say this. Data Relay came in and said that Homeland Security warns grocery stores, gas stations, COVID-19 testing sites of potential terror threats.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that I've noticed now is this kind of second leg of this. And so a quick recap on this week, there was a buildup to would Trump buck the system and reopen everything. He came out yesterday and said, we're reopening America and that it'll all be done, basically by May 1st, but those states that can do it now, they can do it, which is, wonderful to jump ahead like that. We've been pushing this on Twitter, which is New Day 2020. I want to point this out because this really gets to it. Everything should be reopened by May 1st. America's Constitution needs to be respected, and that's the thing that we see people standing up for. When we look in these different places, like Michigan, like Minnesota, we're seeing now in Austin, we're really seeing these protests happen. And the reason is there's been incredible overreach. And we demonstrated on this program, the governor of Michigan came forward and she said, you're not going to be able to buy seeds. You're not going to be able to garden. You're not going to be able to move between your two homes. So you can't, if you have some home on the coast or whatever and you want to drive out there, no, you're not going to be able to do it.
You're still going to pay taxes on that home.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Mm-hmm.
And then she had the audacity to come out and say, well, it's snowing anyway in Michigan, so you're not missing out,
By the way, I just want to say she's got crazy eyes. crazy
There
eyes.
is something kind of fundamentally off balance about it.
Certainly.
And, she's been in there a year and a half as the governor. And boy, this is a very unusual test that she's failing dramatically. And she's moving into the Gavin Newsom. So it's like, who's the craziest governor in America right now? The contest is getting pretty tight, but it's basically her and Gavin Newsom are neck and neck. And I have to say, Newsom, he started it with this whole martial law thing and wanting to make a California nation state and all the rest. But she, with this talking about cracking down on people shopping, she has shown that fascist instinct is embedded when people get too much power and they get giddy. They're in the spotlight. MSNBC wants them to come on and talk to, $30 million a year, Rachel Maddow. And, it's a big money, weird reflection, go round and round. And if you go real deep, you'll actually find two major functions behind it. One, the war machine. Most of those companies are associated with war activities that support these endeavors. And the other one is the pharmaceutical companies. And so war, oil, pharmaceutical, all wrapped up in a nice bow, and you get these weird spokesmen overreaching. Nonetheless, they don't have the right to do it. No governor has the ability to crack down like that. And it's all unconstitutional, whether it comes from the states or from the federal government. There's nowhere in law where it allows for that. So all those actions are completely illegal, which is why they're mostly advisories that are meant to sound like laws, but they know if they took them to court, they would collapse. But they've done such a good job of sort of terrorizing the public with the virus and then terrorizing them with the threat of unemployment that who wants to spend the money to take them into court, after all. But we're going to look at a couple of these because they're so interesting to me. And what we're going to do basically is take the first sort of 30 minutes of the show and go through the recent developments, and then we're going to move into how the Gurdjieff Fourth Way, Bennett, Ouspensky trail comes in here, and how this is what we're talking about in terms of building a new world. Where does that come from? Where does the impetus for that to get started come from? And we're going to get deep into that. I want to do this part first. This is a CNBC article. It actually is based on a New York Times article where the health authorities in New York told the New York Times that they're now going to count the corona deaths differently. First of all, America was the only state, the only country that would include these figures that were not related. So, for example, if you had somebody dying from a different ailment, say a lung ailment or a heart ailment, and they happened to test for the virus, they would just attribute it automatically to the virus. But now they've gone even further. Now they're dropping the test part, so the person doesn't even need to have had anything to do with COVID-19, and they're going to add them in anyway. So in this article, it's New York City struggles to get accurate coronavirus fatality count as more people die at home. That's the headline, okay? But actually, when you read it a little bit clearer, New York is struggling to get an accurate count of deaths. Mayor de Blasio acknowledged Wednesday. On Tuesday, city officials said they would begin counting probable COVID-19 deaths. Probable. That is, maybe somehow we think that this could be related. Who had no known positive laboratory tests but are believed to have died. In other words, based on somebody's opinion. Well, yeah, that could be. But since there's no test, absolutely not. So the numbers then at that point admitted in public. We already knew that they were doing this because so many doctors and people had come forward saying that they were being coached. State officials were being coached to pad those numbers up in terms of deaths specifically, because that's what you really need. Oh my God, we've hit a milestone. It's 10,000 deaths and all the rest. Of course, last year in America, 72,000 people died by drug overdose. The flu takes out many more people than coronavirus ever did. So this is, they realize that they have an issue to bring in a whole different type of tracking technology, and they don't want to let it go. And people suffering in the middle of it, or healthcare workers dealing with it in the middle of it, is just kind of part of the collateral damage of the situation in their view. So from our side, what we have to do is say, every day I look at these numbers, now they're just padding them. They're just saying outright, because at some point it's going to be brought up. Now they're saying, well, we don't know, so therefore we're adding them all. And suddenly New York has a death toll that's through the roof. Now, that's not to say that they haven't had issues in relation to this, and we've put kind of a disclaimer up front in relation to this before, which I think is very crucial, which is that there is there's fundamentally something going on, which is that the virus is taking hold in certain types of communities, among the elderly, for example. But the way that they've described it as this kind of widespread Black Plague, they've backed off on dramatically. A couple of weeks ago, we brought forward that the Imperial College study had collapsed from projecting 500,000 deaths in the UK to 20,000 or under. Now, in terms of how you rate that on any scale, it's a dramatic overreach, overestimation. It's hype, and it's actually criminal hype when you really do it, because you scare all these people and you create situations that can create crime. You mislead governments and all the rest of it. But Imperial College was able to back off, and they went down to this lower number. Fauci said 2.2 million deaths when he started. He moved down to 100,000. Then he moved down to under 60,000. That's what he's projecting for America. And we're seeing that the numbers are much lower than that. So these people started off with this gigantic, this is going to go through the roof. You have the Black Plague and all the rest of it. What we're seeing is that the numbers never supported that, ever, under any circumstances. And also that the numbers were immediately hyped and overcharged. So that means that somebody was shaping our opinions, and they just needed to shape enough of our opinions to have enough of those people freak out so that this thing could be placed this kind of clampdown, or the lockdown that they placed. Look, a lockdown like the one that they placed is unprecedented in our history. So therefore, they needed something beyond what was actually happening. And that's what we got. But there were a lot of people who were saying, oh, well, the hospitals will be overflowing. Look, it's never good to have healthcare workers and middle managers and people caught in the middle of people pumping out a fraud. That's very difficult because they're dealing with real situations. But as we've seen over and over again, the hospital situation was dramatically overrated, and they built these hospitals in the Javits Center that they never used because the situation never got as bad as we were led to believe it was going to be, and thank God. But nonetheless, they used that projection to get us all into this kind of state. Now we're going to go deeper, which is, why do they want us all in this state? And what were the numbers that they were using to get us there? Yes, Miss Olivia.
I just wanted to mention this Circle or Circle K, probably. I heard a suicide being counted as COVID. And Carly asked, no, really? And Circle K came back and said, yes, the roommate couldn't go back and is homeless now. Just an extreme case of what you're talking about.
I have to tell you, I've gotten so many emails from people along this, and from a lot of medical professionals, specifically nurses, telling me that they had patients who, long before the coronavirus, were suffering, and they were expected to die under certain circumstances, and that they were basically, when these things would happen, they were told to change the cause of death. We've seen that throughout. Now, that's a pretty sick thing to do for a lot of reasons. We've also seen people come forward and say, look, they're using this picture of my dad in Europe and saying he's a coronavirus victim and he's still alive and all the rest. So whoever is behind that, we're going to take a deeper look at them. Let's take a look at some of these stories around this to try to get a better snapshot. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X-86. We're weighing out the deep state lockdown, and then we're going to bring in the Gurdjieff Fourth Way setup for this and their view on the crisis in human affairs. That they essentially, I want to say that they really predicted the predicament that we're in, the fine mess, as it were. So this one is, this week President Trump pulled all funding from the World Health Organization because they lied to American authorities. And they have been, the number 2 funder besides America is the Bill Gates Foundation. And we know that Gates has his fingers in this because he has a lot of incentive to hype this. And as we've seen, we've kind of touched on this, so I won't go too deep on Gates tonight, but he's a major figure in this. One of the things I want to point out in relation to this story is that by defunding the WHO and saying that they were favoring China and questioning their leader, who was part of a very dicey operation in Ethiopia, they basically got into a situation where we didn't trust them anymore. So therefore, the footing of the United States by defunding them is saying we don't trust them. Now, Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg today announced that they're going to promote the WHO to combat misinformation around this. So, for example, say I do a report with Olivia, and or someone else does a report, and it shows up on Facebook. They're going to use WHO over a label over that to give people this choice to go to WHO instead of reading it and get rid of the actual reporting on the independent side. And we know they've done this with our stuff. They've done it with all kinds of different people trying to bring things forward, everyone from Stephen Molyneux to Alex Jones. And it's because they cannot survive against any separate narrative working against them. If they have people looking at a range of options of what could be going on, they can't bring this across the end zone. They can't get it over home plate. And so what they need to do is be able to dominate the narrative to a point where you won't be accepting anything else. What I want to say in relation to the WHO in this story, which came out, is that Zuckerberg, by doing this actually, is favoring China and its misinformation over the legitimate independent media in America. So by doing that, he's showing that his interests, whatever the interest is that lies behind Facebook, somehow is related to China. And somehow is related to the op around the WHO coronavirus scare. So that's a very dicey situation for us and people who operate on Facebook, because now we're seeing that this is somebody who's taken something when our government has said they've given us the wrong information and we're defunding them. They're still going forward and promoting them, because remember, China has so many of the Facebook offices, but there's some link there with Google and China and Facebook and this whole social media network. If you go over there to China, you will see so many of the companies and so many of the industry. It's basically like going to America in the 1950s. It is loaded with American companies, and they were exponentially growing. So I believe what was happening was those executives were going over there and they were seeing how well kept that population was, with the social credit system and, threats of torture and all the rest of it. And they like that, and they favor that over here. And they want to get us into a system like that where we can't, challenge them. And Zuckerberg's been on the record before saying, oh, that Constitution is outmoded and all the rest. Now, this is very serious. And I know that there's a lot in independent media which will take these characters and hit them over and over again, like 2 Minutes Hate in 1984, as they do in the mainstream media with somebody like Trump. So they give you your little 2 minutes hate, and in 1984, you walk off satisfied because you've gone after this person. In 1984, the character is Goldstein, who supposedly betrayed the party. Well, in this case, they're using conspiracy, theorists, like David Icke. Well, he becomes the new Goldstein in the. From our point of view, so I want to say someone like Zuckerberg, there are a lot of people who dislike him in the independent movement, for sure. But the fact is that it's based on research. And the fact that he can come forward and promote the WHO over stories that we in the independent media would be doing shows his allegiance just to something else besides America and besides honest reporting, honest media. So whatever it is, even though America has said, hey, look, they gave us the wrong information, we're defunding, Facebook's promoting them, and they're getting rid of misinformation. Misinformation, as is anything that challenges the narrative that's out there in the mainstream media on one particular side of the street. And that side of the street is basically the Democratic, a liberal Democratic side of the street. Although really traditional Democrats wouldn't like the idea of censorship. This is a very interesting thing. So they're creating this kind of new liberal Democrat. I don't even know if you could call it a Democrat. This is somebody who doesn't want to hear anything else except their own weird narrative. And they want to hear that Zuckerberg and Dorsey have the right to do that. But they don't, because that is an open marketplace. So it gets very deep. And let's face it, when these ideas are allowed to compete on an equal battlefield, the truth ideas catch on much better with people than the false hypnosis that's going on and the brainwashing that we see so much in the mainstream media. I have more of this. Some other backdoor reasons why the coronavirus hit. While we'll have people arguing online, oh, shouldn't you wear a mask in public, and don't take your freedom so seriously. The Constitution's not that important. You're saving lives, all this kind of nonsense. And it's comedy hour, folks, because, you're not looking deep enough. Look at this. 43,000 U.S. millionaires will get stimulus averaging $1.6 million each. Now, how much money did you get?
Wow.
If you were lucky enough?
I didn't know. What is it, 1,200?
Yeah, 1,200. There you go. Woo-wee. It's a great time at the Get Down Rotisserie tonight. About $1,200. Over 43,000 U.S. millionaires will get stimulus, averaging $1.6 million each. This is a real story that's well verified.
How is it that we are putting up with this?
This is the bailout. This is inside the bailout. Over 43,000 U.S. millionaires will get stimulus averaging 1.6 million. A little bit of this article here. At least 43,000 American millionaires who are too rich to get coronavirus stimulus checks are getting a far bigger boost, averaging 1.6 million each, according to a congressional committee. The Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act trumpeted its assistance to working families and small businesses, but it apparently contains an even bigger benefit for wealthy business owners. The act allows pass-through businesses, once taxed under individual income rather than corporate, an unlimited amount of deductions against their non-business income, such as capital gains, the Washington Post said. They can also use losses to avoid paying taxes in other years. That gives the roughly 43,000 individual tax filers who make at least $1 million a year a savings of $70.3 billion. Think about that. Is that worth having a coronavirus scare and getting the media on your side? $70 billion. It's getting there. It's in the ballpark. Or about 1.6 million apiece. Not bad. Not bad for a day's work of scaring the hell out of everyone else. Hedge fund investors and real estate business owners are far and away the ones who will benefit the most, tax expert Steve Rosenthal told the Post. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse called it a scandal to loot American taxpayers in the midst of an economic and human tragedy. It's a really good point. Now, there's more to do on that, but take a look now at the environment that we're in, where that type of pilfering is going on. This has nothing to do with the big Federal Reserve bailouts of all those junk bond companies, which we've also seen taking place. This is in a whole different avenue of the CARES Act, and we think, hey, $1,200, people are getting paid off.
Can I just mention that the chat really slowed down because I think you stunned the hell out of people? It's
incredible. I mean, the figures, and what's nice about these figures too is that the people, they're inside the reports in Congress. It's not something that anyone else deduced. It's just there for anyone to pick up and see. But what does it tell us? It tells us that principally the bailouts were aimed at bailing out the higher income aspects of the crash around this to try to artificially supplant the stock market, because if those people have money, then they'll be less likely to dump all their holdings. But nonetheless, that means you made risky investments, you did whatever, and you get 1.6 million, which is very much what they did with the junk bonds too. Remember, the Fed had been wrestling with those and bailing people out over the past 8 years, trying to get that situation under control. And finally, there were forecasts within the Fed in terms of the repo market that they just couldn't get it under control. And a lot of those, dirty players were going to go down. So this crisis came along just in time for them. Now, did they create the crisis in order to get the money? I mean, you can say that that's a possibility. But nonetheless, let's say it just happened organically. The fact that they're getting bailed out is very, very scandalous. So it's a major fact of what we have to look at. So when someone runs up to you and says, oh, shouldn't Americans be wearing a mask in public or whatever? Tell them, did you know that the top 1% just got a $1.6 million bailout when you got stuck with $1,200 and some Cheetos and canned goods? Think about it. That's the real conversation to have there. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep on all the incredible news that has come out this week. The best news is that citizens are coming out of their homes and protesting, as they did in Michigan yesterday. The lockdown actually is over. I'll tell you how this works. It's kind of like the John Lennon, war is over if you want it. Lockdown is over if you want it. Mm-hmm. It's over. What they were trying to do was get people into this situation and see how far they could take it, and they overreached. And now they're facing people who are looking at a future that they've collapsed by getting rid of all these small businesses and really not coming through, basically just barely holding the economy up. And if you look at this structure over the next 9 months, it would completely collapse the United States economy to stay shut. And the people who've come forward and said otherwise are lying. It's easy for Bill Gates with $104 billion to sit there and say, we have to wait around for 18 months till I create a killer vaccine to stuff you full of mercury. But the truth is, if we wait even a little longer with a lockdown like it was, then we would have completely crashed everything with no hope of recovery for many years. Remember, the Great Depression didn't actually turn around until World War II, and that's because of all the mass production. If you look at those figures later in the 1930s, they are terrible. People are still living under completely inhuman conditions. There's lots and lots of street people, and there's bank failures. The stuff continued long after the Great Depression, and FDR put in a public works program, so at least we got people having jobs. And Trump has talked about doing this great restructuring, building bridges and all the rest. And I think that they should, actually. I think they owe that to people they've thrown out of work to create a gigantic public works program, even temporarily over the course of the next year. All right, next, remember all that money that was getting passed around? Another New York Post. They're getting the big ones. Bill Gates becomes top target of bogus coronavirus conspiracy theories. Oh, Bill's getting this. Unbelievable. Poor Bill. Those conspiracy theorists are so bogus. And you know what they said? They said that he did an exercise in October, and those conspiracy theorists think that it was because he knew it was coming. Hey, it's kind of logical in a lot of ways. Like, is that so bad? And what they say in here as pushback is that what a lovely, fantastic philanthropist he is. So Sir Gates is who they want. Now, this is wonderful. I wanted to show this to Ben Garrison, who does incredible cartoons about this. Came up with the COVID 1984 cartoon. It's time for your next vaccine. Doesn't get much better than that.
Wow.
This is really it. We have people in the audience saying, we will obey. Yeah, this is the thing that's moving in the wrong direction on that front. Gates has no medical degrees, none. Didn't finish college even. And, a lot of people who don't finish college actually go on to do great things. That's fine. I'm just saying in relation to this, the idea of touting him as an authority in the medical field without any medical degrees is absurd. He has a foundation, but there's been a lot of criticism of that foundation and a lot of unethical things that have happened as a result of them going into foreign countries and testing on people. So if anything, that's a scandal that's waiting to break in the other direction. I would almost say that as much as they've been really keeping him on the bullseye, there's a lot of information to come out about him. So you might even say the alternative media has gone easy on him in some ways. Okay, I want to get back into, now I said, who's the worst governor? Who's the most fascist governor award? We were going to give it out tonight, and it's been going between Gavin Newsom and our friend in Michigan. But now let's meet the New Jersey governor. The New Jersey governor said he wasn't thinking of the Bill of Rights when he imposed strict social distancing guidelines. That's the New Jersey Governor Murphy. It's very important for us to get our governors to think about the Bill of Rights instead of Bill Gates and defending Bill Gates. It's very important that they remember the Bill of Rights because that's what they're upholding. For example, that would be like a policeman saying, oh, well, here I am. I pulled this guy over. I beat him up. And, I didn't think about the law. And I didn't think about the fact that I was a policeman. What happens? You're not a policeman anymore. Well, if the New Jersey governor can't remember what the Bill of Rights is, then resign. Get out.
They have assistants. They have aides. They have people they can turn to research this stuff before they do anything.
This is one of the best excuses I've ever heard. I wasn't thinking of the bill. I just wasn't thinking about it. Is that okay? I mean, it's kind of like a priest coming up and saying, oh, what about God? So what? It just, it's one of those strange absurdities. It's the arc absurd that we're living under in this very unusual period. But that's not to mention Gavin Newsom, who, in spite of all the stuff that's going on, is like everyone will have to live in this boy in the plastic bubble world, walking around. It's not going to be the same world that you knew. It's going to be this whole new world where we track you. And when you sneeze, you have 5 people take you and take your temperature. No, and you're not a nation state and you're not going to call martial law. The game's over, and on the federal level, they said the lockdowns are over. On the state level, you guys are going to look like idiots if you don't catch up. And the states that are open, you're going to be jealous because things are going to be moving there. The economies are going to be moving there. They're going to be handling those situations and developing the means to better contain any kind of health emergency, including this virulent flu or the coronavirus strains, however you want to categorize it. And I've seen it from a number of different angles, but there's no doubt that they exaggerated the death count, which means whatever it is, it's a lot less lethal than we've been led to believe. And since all the charts that are coming out, the newer charts that are coming out, are showing a much more widespread cases, bringing the death rate down to about where the flu is. So basically, you did all this for the flu. And the flu is a terrible thing, and we should have those protections in place for healthcare workers and all the rest. But nonetheless, you have put us in this footing of a complete unconstitutional lockdown over an exaggerated health risk. Now, nonetheless, you could say on the political side, if they want to go forward and say, well, we didn't realize it was going to be a situation that was going to be manageable. And, we see this even in some of the top writers. I was saying Peggy Noonan at the Wall Street Journal came out and said, well, I actually thought it was going to be much worse the way they were talking about it. But now that, things have come out this way, it's a little bit differently, and I see it differently. That's happening across the board. But what we have to do now is say, all right, you overreacted, you overreached, and this is giving them dramatically the benefit of the doubt. But you need to return now all the authority back and to get off of this trip. And those strange governors like Newsom and the Michigan governor, what is her name? Whitmer, and our friend now.
I'd rather just call her Crazy Eyes.
Yes, one with the crazy eyes. And also our friend Governor Murphy in New Jersey now. He also, these people have it in their power to say, we overreached and we did it in the public's behalf, and now we're opening things up and we're not going to act like psycho-fascists anymore. But if they don't, then it's going to be even more of an explicit overreach, because now they know. Now they have the new numbers, and the new numbers show the hype has gone down dramatically, and we need to really push that forward with them. And I would say, again, lockdown is over. That's it. Lockdown is over if you want it, and we want it now. So this is, I think, a very important aspect of what's happening here. A couple of quick things that came up in the middle of all this. Suddenly, as soon as they announced, Miss Olivia, that the lockdown was being lifted, when President Trump said that, lo and behold, Newsweek came out with an article, and it was all about, and it was from, this time, hidden COG sources. And it was all about continuity of government getting ready to evacuate Washington, D.C. and take over, and how that would happen, and how there's a special unit prepared, and how Homeland is working with them. And suddenly today, our friend Terrence O'Shaughnessy comes out, and he is, of course, the Northcom commander, who is the COG president, who would be taken over with Northcom forces. And he's in the bunker saying, we've got this under control, the enemy is on retreat, and all the rest. But it's very, very strange, again, and we have to kind of keep our eyes open for what's happening here, because they're creating this environment where whenever something moves forward on one side, for example, with Trump declaring that the lockdown is over, we start to get these weird stories coming out again. And COG, which is usually a very hidden aspect of what happens in America, because, COG, after all, is a secret network that is supposed to be there in case there's a surprise attack. And they, in fact, did on this program when he came out, and he said, we've seen Russian incursion into our airspace over Alaska. We had to escort them out. Talk about creating an incident to try to drum this up. Why is the commander of Northcom, why is his mug on all of these mainstream channels? That's never happened in the history of COG before. This is a weird thing to do. And the fact that it keeps coming up whenever Trump steps outside of the box and says, we're going back. Oh, I forgot we are actually under the Constitution. Then these guys, they float this scenario, I believe, to scare them. And I've talked to a few other researchers, like Dr. Joseph Farrell, we've talked about this, and he felt the same way. Everyone, you're watching The Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X-86, and we are going deep now on the developments in this deep state lockdown.
What can you follow that up a little bit? What would that be communicating specifically if it was meant to scare him?
It's a threat that they could create a scenario where the government is under emergency powers and they install O'Shaughnessy as the COG president. I want to show also another thing that's going on in the background here before we get into the mystery school side. And this has to do with Robert F. Kennedy and Bill Gates. Now, on one hand, we have the mainstream media bashing at RFK Jr. RFK Jr., who's done some of the best work with Children's Defense Fund and other things that he's done in exposing the dangers in vaccine injury and how they are very lax around testing and laws and how they can't get sued because of a law in 1986, for example, prevents them from being able to be sued because, let's give you a little background on that. What happened was most of the vaccine companies and pharmaceutical companies in that era of the early 80s were getting sued left and right because vaccines were proving to be hazardous in a number of cases. And they were moving them out and try to create this process that everyone needs this, measles vaccine, whatever it was. And like I said, most people who are opposed to the excessive vaccines don't have any problem with the basic ones. This is a very important thing. When they label someone who's an anti-vaxxer, this kind of like big trigger word in the mainstream media, a lot of those people believe in vaccines up to 28 rounds of vaccines. That's a lot. But they want them believing in 78. If you don't believe in 78, you're anti. And what RFK Jr. tells us is there's 300 in the pipeline. You know what that means? You're basically getting stuck with vaccines for the rest of your life. And all the different conditions that arise out of it, there's no way to sue the vaccine makers. Now, the reason there's no way to sue those vaccine makers is because the law that came out in 1986, because they were all being sued so badly, they came to Washington and they said, you're on your own, develop your own vaccines because, in fact, we're not going to make them anymore because we're too vulnerable to getting sued. So at first, the government thought, well, we'll make our own, which they probably should have. But instead, what they did was they said, okay, we'll go along with this. You can't get sued. Just keep producing them. And then this is how we got into this situation. Now, here's something that's very crucial to understand. The CDC is responsible for $11 billion in the development. They are one of the largest vaccine companies. They have them. They distribute them. The CDC is not like an independent agency, which is completely divorced from financial proceedings. This is what RFK Jr. has brought forward. And he's also brought forward that Fauci, when he was called out by a doctor who was working with him on the development of vaccines, when they were linking them to cancer and leukemia, he shut down their investigations. And he warned them if they kept going, he'd destroy their careers. That's who Fauci is. Keep that in mind. That's the person who's giving you your major dictation from on high about what you should be doing, lockdowns and all that stuff. It's a guy who didn't want to reveal the honest truth about the research that was coming forward. If you want more of that story, go to RFK Jr. And I have some of that here, actually, I want to read. And RFK Jr., of course, is the son of Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General and brother of John F. Kennedy. He was the senator from New York, even though he's from Boston. And he was running for president in 1968 and heavily favored to win after he blew out Eugene McCarthy. And what happened, though, was very dramatic, which is that he was eliminated on June 5th by assassination, and Nixon got in instead. So would you get more of the Vietnam War and all the Nixon dirty trick stuff? All that got entrenched into a system such that even Nixon tried to get out of it, and we know what happened there. They set him up at the end. This is very important to understand that history. When we're looking at this, we're looking at something rather dramatic. I want to demonstrate that these are factions that are fighting it out in the background. This is a crucial thing for us to keep in mind. The faction on the Kennedy side is trying to open up the eyes of the public to the dangers inherent in the vaccines and making the pharmaceutical companies more accountable, just like he's made chemical companies accountable in environmental scandals. He has that background. He's an American environmental attorney, and he's an opponent of vaccination. Now, he's also the president of something called the Waterkeeper Alliance, which is a nonprofit environmental group. He's seasoned. He's got the depth on this. And on the other side, Gates is a real weasel, who's a eugenicist, who is tight with the Rockefellers, and he is in that world, that milieu of Bilderberg and the Davos crowd. So he's coming from a totally different place in relation to humanity, but we're seeing this clash over and over again. And when President Trump first got into looking at vaccines and autism, he selected Bobby Kennedy Jr. And they got together and they talked, and Robert Kennedy Jr. thought, hey, I'm going to be heading up this panel with President Trump, and suddenly it got nixed. Later, we found out that Bill Gates came forward and said, no, don't do that. Don't do that. He's going to mislead you. So he went in there and put the kibosh on it, and for some reason, Trump bought it. This is crucial, I think, because it shows these two sides battling over our future, and the future is very much wrapped up in this kind of medical autonomy versus medical fascism. It's very crucial that this is coming into play, and it comes into play, of course, exactly in this coronavirus situation. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is episode X-86. I want you to take a moment, if you haven't already, and go to darkjournalist.com. Sign up for our free newsletter, because that's going to keep us in touch. We've had tremendous censorship online to such a degree that it's so pronounced over it was, say, even like a year ago.
Oh,
if you think
so
about
much worse.
We know they've thrown all kinds of voices off of YouTube, Twitter, and other places because they can't handle the competition. Because when people get ideas in an open market environment, they have a choice for what they're going to believe. And when you get into a situation like that and these people lose control, what they do is they come down with a very, very heavy boot on dissenting voices or just options. Think about it. You should have the ability to think in different ways beyond just Fox and MSNBC, right?
Are you still going to continue with Bill Gates, or are you moving off of Gates?
I'm moving into this RFK Jr. Statement. But anyway, yes, go to darkjournalist.com. Make sure that you're signed up. The things that we have coming up are, something that you're going to want to hear about first, and it's the best way to do it. Of course, you'll find the show here Fridays at 8 p.m. generally. So, you really are going to look at it from the point of view of just making sure that you're in that loop, because a lot of people tell me, hey, I didn't get my notification from YouTube or whatever it happens to be. The best way to stay on board with us is to be on that newsletter list. Exactly. How are you doing out there?
Good. I did want to. Are you bringing up Marina at some point?
Abramovich?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, she comes in there. You want to say something about her?
No, I just was hoping you were going to leave it out.
I do think it's interesting. Well, let me get to this part first. Why don't you remind me on that?
I will do that.
Of course, everyone knows that one pretty well. She's the Crowleyite, the kind of OTO performance artist, spirit cooker who came out in those Podesta emails. She's deep in with the Clintons, and she does all these kind of bizarre occult rituals as art installations. I often don't even like to comment on other people's sense of these things. I actually usually don't care, but this is so kind of bald-faced that it's rolling in a weird satanic element out in the open. And then the strangest thing that happened with it all was that Gates, who stepped down from Microsoft, but his company, Microsoft, put on her new exhibit. And the exhibit was all this weird virtual reality Satanism stuff. And like I said, just really bad art fundamentally. And what happened was they put it out on Good Friday, which is also a very strange thing to do. And talk about having a tin ear. I mean, that is really incredible. And then it got such a negative reaction that they had to pull it, which I thought was quite fascinating. This is great. They showed up there and had like 600 likes and 24,000 downvotes because it was just like a sick piece of performance art. And fine, if you're going to do sick performance art, laugh and be happy. But my feeling was the relationship there with Gates and the things he was trying to do and what they were pushing with that was just over the top.
I think it's one of the best things that's happened this last week. I mean, we cannot take our eyes off of it because they tipped their hand.
Spirit cooker in charge. I think we have to, on this show, we go very deep on the esoteric side and who's lining up with this kind of Ahrimanic vision. And like I said, I when I look at things in popular culture, I give a very wide berth. I actually don't care about what people do relating to their beliefs or whatever it happens to be. It's just when they plug it into this political system, when they plug it into vaccines, it starts to look like there's some kind of human sacrifice cult operating in the middle of the political system. And when you think about it that way, then, we get into much deeper territory. And that's definitely eyes wide shut, wide open territory. So let's keep going. Yes, you got something else?
I just wanted to mention for anybody who did not tune into it, Molly McCord, who's one of my favorite astrologers, put out an incredible episode this last week.
Yeah.
I think it's Wednesday's episode, and where she mentioned that in, I think it's the year 2000, she was privy to some inside information about someone she calls Richie Rich, who was a CEO in Seattle of what she calls the Acme Corporation. And I don't want to give too much away, but basically it dealt with child pornography. So that is Molly McCord's website and her YouTube
It is very
channel.
interesting. Obviously, it was somebody who was working for Microsoft, and the person, Richie Rich, the character, was obviously Gates. So her story is very interesting about that.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, it is. I think it's very important.
And I will also want to add that as an astrologer, she has been watching his chart all these years and waiting for his downfall.
Yes.
And that it is coming this year. The tides are finally turning. And
this is always a good thing to see from people who have that kind of power and are beyond the reach of any kind of normal investigation, usually, because they're so protected by legal authorities, the political system, and the media. So it'd be nice to think that was true. By the way, her story is very interesting. It doesn't resolve in any direction. It's not like a Q thing where, they're like, and he gets sent off to Gitmo. No, because real stories very often don't end with an end. They're just things that get brought up.
Away. She says, oftentimes people do not get held accountable for their worst crimes. It's for the lesser crimes.
True. Yeah, we've seen that.
But
in the legal
I'll
system,
take what I can get. Thank you very much.
I wonder how that applies to Gavin Newsom. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Now I'm going to go into this a little bit further on RFK Jr., and we're going to jump to the importance of his work and a couple of other things. Then we're going to move into the Gurdjieff Fourth Way section, which I think is very important for us to compare the tools that some of the mystery schools gave us in advance. And it's funny with Olivia mentioning Molly McCord, because anyone who knows me knows I have a great admiration for astrology. And one of the things I can tell you is I've known a lot of people who work around Wall Street. And let me tell you, they utilize it a lot. And if anything, we in the general public need to get far more advanced on what actual astrology is and what those forces are all about. I guarantee you, as we've seen in the past, like with President Reagan and others, they use astrology, as we've seen with Jean Dixon and Nixon and the 5 presidents that she served. A lot of her psychic work was based on astrology as well. So don't discount it as just a kind of a, hey, Mercury retrograde is ruining my day kind of a thing. You can get a lot of information on that tip. Okay, a quick thing. RFK Jr. was on a podcast this week, and he was talking about Fauci and really letting the cat out of the bag. I think he's doing more and more interviews, and I'm hearing more and more behind the scenes in relation to him that he's becoming very public with the information he has. Now, I want to say what a brave figure RFK Jr. is for taking on the vaccine companies. It's a very uncomfortable thing to do when the entire media is wrapped up around this. And he's heard many times that you will be destroyed and all the rest. The family's gone through a lot of tragedy, even recently, of course. So, you know, he's somebody who I think has put it out there. There are people on the independent side who are involved, who are doctors and things like that, who have tried to take RFK Jr. and say, oh, he's just part of the political machine. He's not as good as I am or whatever. And, you know, whenever you see somebody dissing RFK Jr. around vaccines, you know it's extremely suspect. And there was someone who was going to be on this program that I was going to interview, who was a doctor and who's out there doing this a lot. But as soon as I found out the trashing that he was doing of RFK Jr. And saying, well, he's part of the machine, I'm the real thing, and all that, that kind of opportunism should not go by in the independent media. We have enough of it in the mainstream media. When people try to make their bones off somebody else and making someone else look bad in the alternative media, it should be called out. And so when you see that, don't go for it and don't support it. And if somebody is saying that, say, why are you taking down someone who he and his family have been fighting and paying a heavy price for years trying to get the truth out and help ordinary people, and who is really one of the hugest opponents of the Gates Foundation? So for someone to come forward and lay this out makes me look at them in a totally different way. And there's a lot of opportunism. And I will just tell you, on my side, I dropped the interview because it's not worth it to me, because I'm not up for that kind of division. It's just not going to happen on my watch. So this is something that came up, and it's RFK Jr. revealed disturbing information about Dr. Anthony Fauci's medical career in the government, calling out the celebrated physician for a history of disturbing practices ranging from costly cover-ups to outright fraud. Kennedy repeatedly slammed Fauci on the Thomas Paine podcast on Wednesday, revealing disturbing information about Fauci's problematic career, steering key medical policy for the United States. Kennedy described Fauci as a workplace tyrant who has ruined careers of upstanding physicians and researchers in order to cover up scandals and costly medical research disasters at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where Fauci served as director since 1984, 36 years, as part of the National Institute of Health. Tony Fauci, quote, this is RFK, Tony Fauci didn't want the American public to know that he has poisoned an entire generations of Americans, Kennedy said. That's pretty heavy duty. Think about it. Think about how careful RFK Jr. is with his language, and then really listen to this. Tony Fauci didn't want the American public to know that he has poisoned an entire generation of Americans. Wow, Kennedy said, alleging Fauci targeted a whistleblower who was trying to uncover the blood supply in the country was tainted with deadly strains. The whistleblower was trying to uncover the blood supply in the country was tainted with deadly strains. Kennedy said Fauci ruined the physician's career and covered up the crucial research. And that was just one of Kennedy's attacks against Fauci. There were more. Kennedy also targeted Bill Gates, Big Pharma, the media, and more. And he's been doing this now. He's put out his own information on his Instagram, which is very active. And he's been doing these interviews and putting out these positions for the Children's Health Defense Fund. Look, RFK Jr. he's in a position, he's visible enough to really move the conversation into a much better place and to really call these people out. He's one of the few people who can. He's on that level. So if people try to take down RFK Jr. or say, hey, he's a Democrat, look, the Kennedy family are Democrats. You find good Democrats, good Republicans, and good Libertarians. It doesn't work like that with parties. Like, you're supposed to be afraid of one party and only stick to this other party. You know, there's many, many Republicans who are completely corrupt. So we can't go party by party. It doesn't work that way. What you do is you find good people, and they're in all parties. That's the way it works. In this case, I want to point out with RFK Jr., the work he's doing is incredibly brave. So if you see someone trying to take down RFK Jr., don't go for it. You know, it does not measure up to the kind of life that the man has had. And we know also that the Kennedys are targeted in general. Okay, moving along from that. Now that is actually a shot of RFK Jr. at his dad's funeral.
Wow.
And it's a very moving shot. That's who we're talking about. This is the person who understands the space very, very well. And I think his work really holds up on that. And one last thing on this whole COVID nightmare, which we've seen quite a lot. There's so many news stories. I literally could have done the whole show just on this and then for hours more. But there's two quick things I want to point out. One is this, which is COVID-19, a man-made virus, HIV discoverer says, could only have been created in a lab. On this program, we've pointed out Dr. Charles Lieber, who worked for Harvard and worked in a nanotech lab, and he got arrested literally like 5 minutes from here. And they took him in for having these secret Chinese contracts where the Chinese were paying him so much for sharing his research. At the same time, other professors were grabbed in University of North Carolina and other places. So we're looking at the possibility here, in a nutshell, that we've brought forward on this program, and who I've tried to get people like Joseph Farrell and Catherine Fitz to talk about, is what it looks like is that these labs, like Fort Detrick in Maryland, which was shut down last summer, were engaging in high-risk experiments. And remember, there was a lot of scandal around that lab in relation to what was happening with the anthrax scare right after 9/11. We have to keep these things in mind as they move, because remember, around 9/11, again, was the COG influence. That's where they got to use it for the first time. But in relation to the anthrax scare, it came up right after the 9/11 attacks, and that was a deep event. So now we have a deep event here, and we have these other aspects that relate again to Fort Detrick. But the idea, the speculation works like this, that Lieber and a network of other scientists working at these different universities, including in Winnipeg, in Cambridge right here, and in North Carolina, were sharing data on certain types of bio germs and how they could be developed into bioweapons. And that, in the word of one of the scientists who came out talking about this and really putting some of it on the record, is Dr. Francis Boyle, who you may have seen doing these interviews. And he said his idea was that they actually bought it, that the Chinese didn't steal this, that they bought it outright from one of our labs, went over there, and in their own experiments trying to develop a bioweapon, it got free and hit people in Wuhan and then spread out from there. That's one way to look at this. And I think when we look at it that way, we have to remember that what we're talking about, while they're busy talking about locking down the population and all these crazy things that they've been up to, what it really is we should be looking at this deep network of bioterrorism and the labs that develop it. Because if theoretically, if the official story were true, and some lab in Wuhan or some market in Wuhan could shut down an entire world for months and months while they, develop remedies for it. By the way, there have been a number of very successful remedies, like hydrochloroquine that came up, right? How do you pronounce that?
That's it.
That's it, yes.
Hydroxychloroquine.
Yes. That's very important because Trump had emphasized that, and they were getting, some of these doctors came forward and said they were getting 98% rates of recovery with it. But the media had to push it out there and really, put it down. And what happened was they came out with Tom Hanks' wife, Rita Wilson, and she had to say, I took it and I had terrible side effects from it. But she was taking a different version, and it wasn't in the same way. It was just chloroquine itself. So very unusual things that they've been trying to do to really tap down. They didn't want people out of this box. It was basically what it comes down to. They wanted us in that lockdown box, no way out without Gates vaccine. Now Trump has said, you're opening up all the states, get back to work, which is exactly, and again, regardless of what you think of Donald Trump, that was exactly the right thing to do. Whether you're pro or not, because it's unconstitutional to shut down America. You do not have the authority to do it. and the health crisis as presented didn't meet the level. You know, it was not a nuclear attack. And you can't shut down the world over these things. There was a motivation behind this. There was a test run behind this. Remember, in the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott, which we talk about so much in this program, he's always warning about the programs that come in and piggyback on the back of a crisis. And, you know, so you have one crisis, you have terrorism, and then there's somebody else out there who figures out, you know, terrorists are going to strike, but I'm going to do this other thing on top of it. So, you know, and I'm going to be able to create a political climate that will enrich me further. And that is basically the essence of researching the deep state, which, by the way, is the term that Professor Peter Dale Scott, professor at UC Berkeley, coined. That's the term because his books were deep politics, talked about deep events, and the deep events were all these amazing things that had happened, like 9/11 or the JFK assassination, where a different group came in, changed policy, and then moved out. So it's this covert, overt situation. You have a covert government operating underneath the scenes, utilizing things like COG, which are beyond the reach of normal Congress people, for example. So this is, in a way, how we have to kind of understand and orient ourselves around the real things that are taking place, because otherwise we get lost in battles over, did Trump send New York enough masks, you know, and these types of things. Those are the petty fights that they want you to get lost in. And eventually it's going to come down to, hey, Trump should have done something sooner. Let's get him out of office. And, you know, let's put lobotomized Biden in. You know, I hate to see the Democrats really try to pretend that this is a legitimate candidate, but that's another story. But I would say this in relation to that is I'm predicting here that Biden will not be the final nominee there for the Democrats, and that something is going to take place that's going to introduce a different candidate to run against Trump. But they've been able to certainly coalesce a lot around Biden. Another thing I want to mention about what happens in the background and why it's so important is that, you know, when we're looking at this, all those candidates that got out after Super Tuesday were dramatic. You know, you remember Pete Buttigieg, who was the media darling, and I guess Elizabeth Warren hung around a little bit, but, you know, Amy Klobuchar, all of them, they just went running for the hills as soon as Super Tuesday happened. And it was not the situation that they were in. They did not have to run for the hills. They had more to gain by sticking around. But they all got out and they endorsed Joe. And this is interesting because then we have the weird story. It's almost like somebody told them, hey, there's not going to be any campaigning. There's not going to be any public events because this op is going to be taking place. So therefore, if you lay out now, you know, you might get some reward down the road. And then we have Bernie Sanders getting out, and you know, what has to be the most spectacular, like, build up and then let down to absolute zero. And, you know, when you think about the situation with Sanders, it literally just looks like he ran to pay off, to basically line his pockets. Because to get out that quickly and to really make no kind of big thing of it with Biden and to really let your followers that way, it's quite fascinating. So I think there's a lot going on in the background. I want you to keep an eye on, as I've talked about the unity ticket before. The unity ticket I originally envisioned was former Secretary of State John Kerry with Mitt Romney. And there's a lot of reasons why the way that the media is handling Romney still tells me that something's happening there. He's still in this ball game, and it's hard after the Corona thing to get a real handle on what's happening with that race.
I'm just going to jump in here for anybody who thought that there was nothing there. Okay, I personally know someone who knows John Kerry. Okay, who told me after DJ came up with this theory, actually, that was totally true. So that's insider information. He was dying to get into the race. I don't know what he's waiting for.
It's very interesting. Kerry was looking for the opportunity, and the sources from a lot of different angles were coming out and saying that. Now, Kerry's been working very closely for Biden. So this is very interesting, because if Biden shows up as being not mentally capable, which we know is the next interview could be the one, then he may throw those delegates and all to Kerry, who may then select Romney as his running mate. That's a scenario that I've put forward before, but it's something to keep in mind as we're going down the road here, because a lot of this, and I mean a lot of it, could have been oriented around this huge Fed bailout, one, and two, taking the reins of government back from the Trump administration. That has to be kept in mind. Yeah, what you got?
Nothing. I'm reading the comments.
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
You know.
Okay. Go ahead. Say something.
Well, no,
what
just a lot of people just not into Kerry. But it's not about supporting him. It's about predicting what they have planned, what they have up their sleeve.
No, yeah. You have to be careful. Here's how you get, here's how somebody gets sucker punched. By being so into like, my guy can win, and like Trump's infallible, and we've seen all that with the Q crowd and all the rest. It doesn't work like that. These are two parties vying for power. Anything can happen in the world, as we've seen. They could create a scenario where they introduce COG and say Trump has coronavirus. Look, nothing works. This isn't a sports match. You might like your team. I might like my team, whoever it happens to be. Libertarian, Democrat, Green Party, it doesn't matter. On the ground, these are all forces that can manipulate public power and public interest. Kerry has a background that none of the Democratic candidates had. He actually had been a Democratic candidate and a Secretary of State and a senator for many years. He has the connection with Biden that if Biden were to fail, he would be somebody who could step in, because we already know that Bernie wasn't acceptable because he had actual fans. So this idea, and I've seen this before, when people get worked up around Trump support, or if they're really locked in to the Democrats getting rid of Trump, that doesn't matter. It literally doesn't. It's just opinions flowing. That's okay. We all have our different opinions. But in terms of journalistic reporting and what's happening, if John Kerry were to assume the reins from Biden, then it would be a much more dramatic race. And if they try to make Trump look bad by collapsing the economy, as they've been trying, then whoever was in that spot would have a much better chance. I believe Biden has no chance because of his mental faculties going into something like a debate or even a convention speech. It's going to trip him up. And they must know it too. And we saw the very strange endorsement speech for Biden from Obama, where he just gave a long 5-minute intro about him and Michelle being interested in helping people with coronavirus. That's not an endorsement speech. And he finally came out and said those things. But wouldn't you call it basically? It was
the most lackluster.
It was
weird, uninspired. He said all these words, which I guess equaled an endorsement, but yes. You didn't feel like one at all.
Yes.
Certainly not enthusiastic endorsement.
It's incredible, actually, when you think about it, because he had the opportunity to help Biden right out of the gate. And he waited, but he waited even after everybody was basically out of the race. And that's a long time to wait from when everybody was out. So for me, Obama there, he wanted to make sure that Bernie didn't get it, but there's something else happening and they're privy to it and we're not. But nonetheless, the unity ticket, Romney and Kerry, we have to keep our eyes open for that, because that's a rising situation on the horizon, for better or for worse. Okay, everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to go into the second part of the program and take your questions, but first...
let's take a deep breath.
I think we're kind of caught up there. Now, we're going into the depths of Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way. There's a reason why I have threaded in the Fourth Way into this show. But before I tell you about that, I want you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, which is a free newsletter, and make sure that you have that direct pipeline with us. With the incredible lockdowns, we've seen incredible censorship and people getting thrown off social media left and right. Incredible, I would say, electronic harassment even for people who are doing this kind of work. I've had my own levels of that, but it's kind of interesting to me how prevalent it is at this point. But the way I would look at it, the easiest way for us to stay in touch with each other is for you to sign up for the newsletter and get that in your inbox every Friday, letting you know what shows are coming up. And it gives you a direct link to join the program live and ask questions of us here as we're going to take in the second part of the program. So go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for that. While you're there, get behind the program, subscribe to it. We've made it incredibly affordable for you to do that and have access to all kinds of things there as a subscriber, and we really appreciate that support. Okay. Gurdjieff, The Fourth Way, Ouspensky, J.G. Bennett, and a crisis in human affairs. Now, it's interesting for me that we need a really important mystery school example to help us kind of reflect on the period that we're in, that they've given us so much information about surviving and making it through and developing a new world. This is what the mystery schools were about, from theosophy to Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy, which is still very active, with Waldorf schools and the biodynamic farming. By the way, biodynamic farming is probably one of the best things that someone can be doing right now, giving all the kind of food crisis atmosphere that we've been hearing, the breaking down of supply chains, the fact that we were so dependent on China and that's not going to work anymore. So this idea of food and proper food development is going to become very crucial in the future. So interestingly enough, Rudolf Steiner's work is very well placed in the middle of all that. But along with that development of the mystery schools was the Fourth Way. Now, the Fourth Way was brought over eventually to America and the West by P.D. Ouspensky and Gurdjieff and Bennett. But it started really in 1915 after Ouspensky got to meet with Gurdjieff, after he had gone to the East and looked for these mystery schools. And he did a lecture series called In Search of the Miraculous. Ouspensky did. And he was a mathematician and a Russian journalist for some of the leading newspapers there in Moscow. And they tracked his journey to the East and stuff. He'd send back stories, and some of those are very interesting. But he was looking for Eastern masters and this tradition of mystery schools because he knew from all of his research that we needed something more. You know, they talked about political revolution then, and the Russian Revolution they got in 1917, along with World War I in that era too. But he realized from his own kind of spiritual point of view that the world needed something more than just political solutions, that we had to be able to change people on a deep core level and reconnect them with some of the deeper aspects and deeper qualities that they had. Yes.
Because we are broken machines.
Well, yes, you're jumping ahead. I like it. But it is the Gurdjieff work, and what really surprised Ouspensky is that it was so different from even theosophy or the other things that were available in that period. Because, for example, a lot of them were taking you in theosophy when it broke down, because it had this incredible flowering period and then got very distorted, as a lot of organizations will. But in Gurdjieff's mind, a lot of it depended on imagination, and that there were people coming through these things thinking, oh, I'm an ascended master now because I read Annie Besant's book. And all this stuff was very helpful. I believe the material that came through theosophy was very important. But I think with Gurdjieff, they wanted to come in from a different angle, the mystery schools. They wanted to come in from an angle of forget about all that stuff. Forget about reincarnation. Forget about, cosmic masters and all the rest of it. Here's a program. Here's a system of development where you can, in everyday life, apply these principles and move into a higher consciousness. So their fundamental issue with humanity was that humanity was a machine, and it was a sleeping machine, and that it needed to become aware of all its parts, and it needed to awaken. And fundamentally, that the society that we were in was dependent on us being in this kind of sleep state, and that we needed to arouse ourselves from this, and that there were a series of methods that he brought forward for this, and the methods became known as the Fourth Way. So the Fourth Way was a method of spiritual and conscious development that was different than the three other ways, which were different types of spiritual schools, one of them being the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, and the way of the yogi. These are different doorways to expanding consciousness and expanding and spiritually evolving. It's very interesting that, a fakir, for example, in India, could lie down on a bed of nails and not show any marks. So they had this incredible ability. Let's just say in modern times, somebody who walked on coals is the same type of principle. But they're demonstrating an incredible mind over matter with that. A yogi has the ability to go into incredible mystical states. And with a priest, the way of the priest and how that led to spiritual enlightenment was devotional in Gurdjieff's system. That they developed such a devotion for God that that's a way of spiritual evolution. So the way of the fakir, the way of the yogi, and the way of the monk. So the yogi was mysticism. The priest was this incredible devotion, this loving religious devotion, which developed a strong religious feeling. And the mind over matter of the fakir. All of those were spiritual evolution paths. But something that was crucial for the period that we're in, which was missing, was the ability to, in the confines of everyday life, evolve a spiritual system. So the Fourth Way is something that Gurdjieff learned from something that he called the Sarmoon Brotherhood, or Sarmoon. And this brotherhood was buried in the heart of Central Asia. And they had been spread out from originally being located in Egypt, and he had heard about them in his travels, and he had looked for them and found connections to them after a period of about a decade. And he spent a lot of time working with them, and his background and the way that he talks, those brotherhoods are so secret that the way that he talks about them and the experiences around them, you can always tell that there's a layer on top which is not quite accurate about where things are, about the people involved and all the rest of it. There's definitely keeping of the secret. But he brought forward incredible things like the Enneagram and like these incredible dances that were like dervish dances. And he brought forward so many different things that were new and unusual that Ouspensky, who became his main pupil, helped him dramatically to get these into that system, because Ouspensky was already an author. He'd written Tertium Organum. He already was very well established in those esoteric circles. The important thing, I think, when we look at Gurdjieff's work now is that he pointed to a period of societal collapse that would happen. And he talked about how crucial it was for this new world to be born out of that. And in order to do that, we had to develop something within ourselves that the society at large was basically robbing us of. And so this is kind of the foundation of where Gurdjieff was coming out. He was sent out from the mystery schools. He had developed this system, and he was basically put out there as somebody who was coming in from a totally different angle of the kind of spiritual enlightenment, cosmic masters of theosophy. It's almost as if something went wrong in how the mystery schools were trying to roll things out. And we've seen this in the work of Rudolf Steiner. He talks about how when they were first working with humanity after looking at this incredible scientific materialism coming in, that they were looking at humanity and saying, in 100 years, they're not going to be recognizable. We need to do something. And what they ended up doing was all of that kind of spiritualism craze that came around having to do with seances and life after death that became so popular in the 1850s and 60s, the Fox sisters and all the rest. This is a very important psychic flowering for America. And it was their way of giving us back that deep innate knowledge and being able to use it again without misusing it. Because, if you look into the history, those mystery schools carried the information down through the centuries, whether it was Knights Templar or Hermeticism, School of Pythagoras, the School of the Prophets with Elijah, the Essenes. All of these groups were holding this sacred knowledge, the Sufis. And in many cases, there's a lot of correlations between the Sufis, the Naqshbandi group of Sufis, and Gurdjieff's work. It does come in, and it's obvious that they had interlocking relations with each other. But Gurdjieff was sent out there on the world stage very unusually. He's a very unusual guy. He's definitely advanced. He's a master hypnotist. He seems to have incredible control over his body, which he learned in these schools. And anyone who was in his aura thought he was an incredible teacher. And he was prone to, according to Ouspensky, even to shapeshift, which is he could appear like, and I don't mean into something fantastic, but I mean he could appear at one point to be like a little like homeless guy looking for a cigarette to being an incredible businessman, and he could shift into these different presentations. And that was the kind of mastery that he developed by working in these schools. They learn how to develop the ability to present themselves in different ways and have people view them in different ways. But his presence on the world stage just before World War I, again, shows us the mystery schools had come to a point where they had rolled out theosophy, they had rolled out anthroposophy and Steiner's work. And Steiner himself said, look, if we don't, the advent of World War I, if we don't prevent this, and the mystery schools failed in this interval, and we'll have a chance to come back in 100 years and do this again. But in that interval, it was the Gurdjieff work that comes up. And I think it's a hard lesson, the Gurdjieff work, and very rewarding as well. So the system comes out, and Gurdjieff is doing the system with Ouspensky. And then they go through the Russian Revolution together. And I'm going to read you a couple of interesting quotes, which might give us some idea about why Gurdjieff was telling Ouspensky, it's actually through crisis that we can develop this new world. And that's a shot of Ouspensky and Gurdjieff around this period. And Gurdjieff really being that teacher that was giving Ouspensky hope that he could learn something new. Eventually, Ouspensky would break off and teach his own version of Gurdjieff's work, claiming that he learned to separate the teacher from the teaching because Gurdjieff wasn't easy. He definitely was in that pose of challenging his students quite a bit, and being his chief pupil there, Ouspensky, Gurdjieff challenged him quite a bit. So a couple of interesting quotes from this period. I'm also going to bring in this shot of J.G. Bennett because he becomes so important as the link between Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, and he is also a mathematician, and he is also a politician in England, and he will become somebody who absorbed the teaching from both Ouspensky and Gurdjieff and will bring it into the 60s and 70s, and he's kind of the last remaining chain that brings us into the modern era before that work dissolves into something else. So let's read a couple of these interesting quotes around the Fourth Way work to understand how it works with what's happening now. In 1973, just before he died a year later, actually in 74, Bennett said, "This period is the greatest opportunity that has existed for many thousands of years for the Fourth Way activity, or the work, as they called it. Not for thousands of years has there been such a need for people who are able to work. The reason for this is that the transition from one system to another can only come about through a third force. It cannot come from either the governed or the power possessors." This is very important, I think, for us to keep in mind, which is very often we're looking in this political system to have a political revolution, enlighten the world. And we're like, couldn't we just get the right political leadership? But in fact, what they're saying here is that there's a third force. So we have the citizens and we have their rulers. But there's a third force that needs to come into play. And we're going to get into what that is. And the third force comes about as a result of the work of the Fourth Way. Now, how did Gurdjieff reveal what the Fourth Way was? What did he say about it? This is the way that he describes what it's for, which I think is very important. Quote, "The Fourth Way is never without some work of a definite significance, is never without some undertaking around which and in connection with which it can alone exist. Schools of the Fourth Way exist for the needs of the work which is being carried out in connection with the proposed undertaking. They never exist by themselves as schools for the purpose of education and instruction. There's a reason. For example, the mystery schools need to give something new to humanity. Suddenly the Fourth Way work appears. It has its mission. It might have a timeline. It's going to come out there. It's going to present these things, and it's going to go back under. It doesn't maintain itself as an ongoing organization. And I think the way that Bennett described this is very interesting to me. He said it's like the spreading of seeds, and then they go back underground and those seeds come up. So it's very interesting to think about the seeds that have sprung up from anthroposophy, from the Gurdjieff work, from theosophy. We've seen quite a few, but it seems like this is the era really where the work can come forward. So again, Gurdjieff is saying schools of the Fourth Way exist for the needs of the work which is being carried out in connection with a proposed undertaking. It is actually construction. It's a method. It's a system to get from one place to another. I think that's important for us to keep in mind. What Bennett said, Gurdjieff told him, because he was a student twice, first in the early 20s and then later in the late 40s. And in between, he was a Ouspensky student and he was forbidden to talk to Gurdjieff, which is pretty interesting. But he went back to him after Ouspensky died. But what Gurdjieff said to him first, I think is very interesting also. Bennett's first meeting with Gurdjieff, he said, quote, "Gurdjieff told me, you have the possibility of changing, but I must warn you that it will not be easy. You're still full of the idea that you can do what you like. In spite of all your study of free will and determinism, you have not yet understood that so long as you remain in this place, you can do nothing at all." That's very interesting, this idea of doing what you like. That is, doing what you like irrespective of circumstances. So he was going to have to put in more in order to get something out of the Gurdjieff work. Interesting little side note about J.G. Bennett, who would carry on Gurdjieff's work for years, is that the first way that he met Gurdjieff was he was sent to spy on him by the British military, which he was a part of. So that gives us some idea of Gurdjieff's role there and the strange fate of these people colliding as well. As part of what Gurdjieff calls his research on the human psyche, he would talk about deliberately courting the sharp, energetic events such as civil wars and revolutions to observe the extraordinary mental state of people engaged in conflict. This is very important. He says he had sought conversations with various revolutionaries over the previous years in Italy and Switzerland, and certainly referring to the Mountain of Truth anarchist community at Ascona, which was founded in 1900. And rather than let us conclude such activity suggests intelligence gathering or simple thirst for excitement, he says that from it all has arisen in him a new aim. Quote, this is Gurdjieff, and this is Deconstructing Gurdjieff is the name of that book. "I must discover at all costs," this is Gurdjieff, "some manner or means for destroying in people the predilection for suggestibility which causes them to fall easily under the influence of mass hypnosis. I'm going to read it again. I must discover at all costs some manner or means for destroying in people the predilection for suggestibility which causes them to fall easily under the influence of mass hypnosis, unquote. What he had observed in civil wars and stressful situations is that the crowd was always under a kind of mind control. And this is early. This is at the turn of the last century. So they've really perfected that now. Just think of the corona hype. Everyone is under a kind of mind control about it. They've made it that way, and it's very hard to shake that off. And what Gurdjieff was getting at was, we need these tense situations to get an exaggerated version of how people are responding to the mind control to penetrate through to wake us all up. Now, when I think about the incredible things that have been done to keep people in this whole, under the technocracy and under the latest move into transhumanism, and to absorb them into this kind of technological reality without any regard for their spiritual destiny or for their higher conscious aspirations, just to make them part of the harvesting of this thing. We start to understand Gurdjieff's work from a much deeper place and how appropriate it is in our century, from Steiner's work to Gurdjieff's work to Theosophy. In the 21st century, it's like they gave us the whole blueprint for what was going to happen and the tools we would need to develop as a result. So that's something for us, I think, to keep in mind as we go deeper here. And before I go into this next section, I want to ask Miss Olivia how we're doing out there.
Oh, everybody's listening intently, as am I.
Listen, whenever I'm working around the Gurdjieff stuff, I know the possibilities and the potentialities deep in that work and how we need to bring it forward. And over the years, I've been around those groups. I worked with those groups for a time, and they're always small groups. They're always very efficient in the way that they are, they'll do cycles of teaching and then withdraw. And, there are all kinds of different types of groups of the Gurdjieff work. There's the Gurdjieff Foundation, there's Fellowship of Friends, which is largely Ouspensky oriented. Then there's the Bennett groups, which work off of Bennett's work with Gurdjieff. And I can't say that, they all have different types of advantages, but I think in terms of work, that the spirit of the Gurdjieff work doesn't really reside in any particular institution that's studying his work, oddly enough, as far as I'm concerned. But I do feel that one thing that they acknowledge is the incredible power of a group of people working together. And some of the things that Gurdjieff shared with Bennett about societal collapse is that the groups that would survive would be small groups that were oriented around things like the Fourth Way. And he had talked about those groups being, in some cases, no more than 100 people. So you can see the power of these various communities that come across.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Okay, so in the 60s, we had all these communes start up.
Yes.
And, I've been doing lots of research on that. So would you say that you could approach a commune or an intentional community in a Fourth Way?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And how would that be different from how
they certainly have had them as well. And I've known some of them. I think it's difficult because the Fourth Way is so oriented around the teacher. And everyone, once you read about guys like Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and Bennett, you want those teachers to live up to be that quality. And it's tricky because, in the real world, it's difficult to get that kind of commitment. This was their life's purpose. What I think that we can get from the work that they've laid down is, whether it's intentional communities or working with ideas and networking with ideas spiritually, and people starting to develop that trust and experience with each other over time, in being able to lay those ideas out in a forum like this. This is very important because one thing that the Gurdjieff work teaches us is that it only really can be involved in a group. That is, there's only so far you can get on your own with a book. And that it requires group activity, because in group activity, it changes and we get perspective from other people. There's something inside the Gurdjieff work, which is called, when you do it, which is called the chief feature. And everyone has a chief feature around which all of their other qualities satellite around. And the chief—
Is that a negative thing or a positive thing? Or
well, this is the interesting thing. It depends, because the chief feature is sometimes called the chief fault, but it's a chief characteristic. And you can find it in somebody. One of the qualities that Bennett had that Gurdjieff pointed out to him, he said, "You're always starting things." There wasn't the follow through. And so this was a great thing. And then when Ouspensky had worked with him sufficiently, he's like, I've been working with you for years. Can you tell me what my chief feature is? This is something that's supposed to be revealed to me. And it's something that you can't see yourself, this chief feature. And Gurdjieff said, your chief feature is extreme individualism. And this prevented Ouspensky from having that sense of community with other people, and it made him difficult to work with.
Extreme whatism?
Individualism.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what it turned out.
I wouldn't have thought that. I would have thought he was kind of strident. He had very high standards, and that nobody could meet up with those standards, right? So he was constantly disappointed, right?
Yes.
By life, by people, by everything.
So perfectionism.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I don't think I've ever told this story, but I'll mention it here because I met someone who worked with Gurdjieff, actually, and he was quite elderly when I met him, and it was a long time ago now. It's over 2 decades. No, it's about 2 decades ago. And I talked to him about how Gurdjieff worked with him, and he was a very interesting guy. And I try to get this out of him, what my chief feature was. And so I asked him a few times when I met him, and the follow-up time when I met him, because a lot of people try to figure that out. And certainly a guy like him who had worked with Gurdjieff and then spent decades afterwards working. And the only thing he would tell me was that he said you couldn't handle it. That was back then. So whatever it was, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what he was talking about, but that's pretty good. And then I know that he had told someone else that they had a hidden bossiness, which is pretty good. So yeah, bossiness was their chief feature. I want to tell an interesting and strange story, since we're in the kind of realm of strange stories here around Gurdjieff's work, which is there's an interesting chapter around what Gurdjieff thought the Fourth Way work could do and when it could launch. And Bennett tried to get from him what had gone wrong, because apparently the advent of the Fourth Way in the 20th century was to help us develop something, because something had gone wrong in society. And we needed to develop this quality in a hurry to balance out all of this achievement. Now, there's a little bit of that in the Steiner work, too. It's almost like there are people behind the scenes trying to get us up to speed before this thing hits. And for all we know, it's the big Armon cyborg and the technocratic terror that's coming forward. It very well could be, especially with all the references to man as machine in the Gurdjieff work. But here's something I found quite fascinating. Bennett had said that Gurdjieff wrote something called The Herald of the Coming Good in the early 1930s, and that had withdrawn it from publication after an unusual incident had taken place. The incident was that Gurdjieff had something called the Priory, which was a very large chateau in France, and that became the school for the harmonious development of man, and which became sort of the cornerstone of Gurdjieff's efforts. And Ouspensky was not a part of that. He is the person who kept and preserved Gurdjieff's teaching before he did that, so from 1915 to say about 1923. And so we fundamentally know most of Gurdjieff's work from the work he did with Ouspensky. That's the In Search of the Miraculous book. Because oddly enough, Gurdjieff didn't come out and say, here's a book of my teaching and have at it. He wrote Meetings with Remarkable Men. He wrote some other things. But the real manual for working with the Fourth Way comes out of the Ouspensky work In Search of the Miraculous, which is absolutely fascinating book and has that kind of impact on people, which it changes their lives. People say that about books like Scientology and stuff. And, it's funny, if I think of a book like In Search of the Miraculous versus Scientology, it's like, thinking about a bad science fiction Spider-Man movie versus an incredible cinematic classic. I mean, Scientology has nothing to do, has no real foundation the way that the Gurdjieff work does. But I think what's interesting here is that Gurdjieff tries to move that institute to New Mexico. And there are a number of forces in America that are trying to help him. And one of them is a senator from New Mexico named Bronson Cutting. Now, this is a very interesting character, and he is somebody who, there's a figure named A.R. Araj, who started the term the New Age, and had a magazine called The New Age. And he is somebody who tried to bring Gurdjieff in a big way over to America. And Gurdjieff spent a lot of time in New York setting up study groups, doing demonstrations of his dervish dances by developing these dancers. And by all accounts, these were very mesmerizing performances. But this senator who was helping him set this up died suddenly as he was going to meet Gurdjieff in Washington, D.C. He was flying from New Mexico to Washington, D.C., and they crashed in Missouri. And Bronson Cutting is a very interesting character because he was also trying to make it after the Depression so that the creditors and the banks had to keep 100% of the money that they were lending out on board. And he was quite a Wall Street whistleblower on his own, his background. So he had that honesty streak. This explosion of his plane was so suspicious that it created the entire air safety department at the time in 1935, I believe it was. But in any case, there was Gurdjieff sitting in the middle of Washington, D.C., waiting for this man who was going to connect him in with this whole developing his institute now in New Mexico. That would have given the mystery schools in America an incredible shot in the arm, and the Fourth Way schools would have been, in development in America and been part of the political system and all the rest of it. Instead, the senator died in the plane crash, and Gurdjieff's hopes were dashed. Now, interestingly enough, and Gurdjieff went into kind of a malaise after that, which he recovered from at the end of his life. But in the 30s, there's this period. And then when he goes back to Paris, it's occupied by the Nazis. And so there's a lot of things that disrupted the Fourth Way work at that point. But interestingly enough, he had put out a book just before the senator crashed in the plane called The Herald of the Coming Good. It's a very unusual little book. And eventually he withdrew it from publication after the difficulty of not being able to open up things in New Mexico and the death of the senator. I have a feeling there was a large-scale mystery school sabotage that took place there, and it had to do with the political system and all the rest of it, because as Gurdjieff and Steiner have both pointed out to us, the secret societies and the mystery schools are deep, deep, deep in the American and European political process, especially here in America and in the UK. So there's a little piece in this book that caught my attention when I went back and reread it with this in mind, because everyone, including Bennett, felt it was strange that he withdrew this from publication. And later, he told his students not to read it, which is interesting enough. The thing that I found in here was this, which I think was where the Fourth Way schools were going. And it was to set up against a crisis in human affairs. It was to be set up in the United States. And the groups, the way that he talked about setting up the groups were like this. Listen closely. People entering the institute are divided into three categories. This is the institute he was going to set up in New Mexico. The first include persons aiming at self-development in accordance with a program specially drawn up for them. The second includes persons who pursue the methods of the institute with a view to studying one or another subject of their choice. Also those persons who seek to be cured by the methods of the Institute. The third includes persons who attend only the general lectures and study one special subject indicated for them by the Institute. People in the first category will in the future, as is prescribed, be divided into three groups called the exoteric group, EX. That's the group on the outside. They're in study groups, they're in their regular lives. The second group, which is I've not heard of before, the mesoteric group, MESOTERIC. That's the second level. The third level, the deepest level, just like the mystery schools, the esoteric group. I've pointed out before that the mystery schools work on these levels. The mesoteric group and this level is what I believe Gurdjieff withdrew this book for, because it suggests the plan of what the mystery schools were moving into. The next level from people being in a legitimate situation of a mystery school, which goes far beyond just joining something publicly. You know, those things are always good for study groups or whatever it happens to be. You see a lot of bogus things from mystery schools, you know, now, unfortunately, or people using the name, you know, Ascension or whatever it happens to be, or, you know, I'm Edgar Cayce reincarnated, you know, that's junk. That has nothing to do with the level that they're talking about. The mystery schools that we're talking about here are these schools that have guided humanity and civilization for millennia. And they step in and influence the culture at times. And their footsteps basically can be identified. And that's what we do a lot on this program with exsteganography in following them up. So what I think is going on here, and what he says, all newly admitted pupils in the first category belong at the beginning to the exoteric group. Later, they should, according to personal merit, pass into the mesoteric group, and then again, according to merit and to the degree of comprehension, pass into the esoteric group. I think it's this mesoteric level that this school was going to be set up for, and that was what was going to be able to help change the culture. And something in that plane crash and in the ripping up of Gurdjieff plans for studying this and opening this institute in America, he withdrew that piece so that it could be recaptured at some point in the future. And this is what that period says to me. Now, Bennett mentions this also. And of course, to recap, Bennett was this really deep student of both Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. He spent all these years working with Ouspensky, only to go back to Gurdjieff at the end of his life. But what he says is very interesting about this, and in terms of what we're talking about here, which is creating a new world under the circumstances of this great strain that we've all had to live through recently. It gives us a snapshot as we're going into this period, which is absolutely fraught with these different dangers, whether it's technological chipping, the world at war. You know, we're moving into this period. The coronavirus thing, if it did anything, it told us that there are forces moving to harvest humanity on a different level than they have before. So we need that key that the mystery schools have left us. And I would really use theosophy and anthroposophy and the Gurdjieff work and the Cayce work as really, that's the center of the work that was put forward. But here's what Bennett had to say. Let us look at what Gurdjieff left behind him. 3 generations have passed since he began his search, nearly a generation since he died. In 75 years, the entire world situation has been turned upside down, and it is not too much to say that the old world has died. Only on the material plane have predictions made at the end of the 19th century in any way been fulfilled. Though the technology of the last 25 years could not have been foreseen, great advances could have been and were predicted. What was unforeseen, though predictable, was the human failure. Gurdjieff, growing up in the midst of war and revolution, could see perhaps better than Western Europeans and Americans how things were going. A war that was not even a war, the young husband expedition in 1902 in Tibet was in Gurdjieff's eyes a precursor of disaster for everything going forward. He referred to it again and again in his writings and conversation as a crushing blow to the hopes of mankind. It is in fact a history that since 1903 the world situation has progressively deteriorated. It was not until the end of the 1960s that mankind began to awaken to the full extent of the impending danger. This is what we're facing now. But what did they mention there? The young husband expedition of Britons going into Tibet greatly disturbed the mystery traditions that were in Tibet. And oddly enough, Gurdjieff was in Tibet during that period. So he got a front row seat. A quick thing about this. The British expedition to Tibet, also known as the British invasion of Tibet, or the Young Husband expedition to Tibet, began in December 1903 and lasted until September 1904. The expedition was effectively a temporary invasion by British Indian forces under the auspices of the Tibet Frontier Commission, whose purported mission was to establish diplomatic relation and to resolve the dispute of the borders of Tibet and Sikkim. In the 19th century, the British conquered Burma and Sikkim, occupying the whole of the southern flank of Tibet. The expedition was intended to counter Russia's perceived ambitions in the east and was initiated largely by Lord Curzon, the head of the British India government. These forces and these factors are still active, which is why I think Gurdjieff saw so much in this. But oddly enough, Gurdjieff had a role there with the Dalai Lama during this period, 1902. And when we think about Gurdjieff's access to ancient knowledge, there was so much there in Tibet at the time that Gurdjieff, with telling us about the Saramung Brotherhood, obviously the Tibetan trip is how he got a great deal of this knowledge. So he was telling us that this young husband expedition, the British war and excursion into Tibet, kind of messed everything up and set the stage for the world wars and the situation that we're in now. It needs that kind of deeper sweep for us to understand whatever it was that those mystery schools held in Tibet and they were releasing for humanity got disrupted dramatically by this British incursion. By the time Gurdjieff died in 1949, it was Ouspensky who died in 1947, he had left behind groups that followed his teaching, groups that followed Ouspensky's teaching, and groups that followed Bennett's teaching. It had splintered the work dramatically. But In Search of the Miraculous, which Ouspensky had held on to till he died, came out in 1947, and just before Gurdjieff died, it made everyone understand perfectly what Gurdjieff's system was. So much better than Gurdjieff could have explained it himself, because what he said about Ouspensky is he had a tremendous memory. And so he recalled every detail of the system that Gurdjieff had brought out of the Saramung Brotherhood. So when we look back at the incredible legacy that they've left us here, they've been trying to give us this hint that there's something deep, deep in the work of the Fourth Way and that the mystery schools were bringing forward, which we were going to need for making a new world in this century. And they've set us up with the various methods and the various experiences that these people have had. When you think about J.G. Bennett being the last in that line and forming Claymont Communications and Sherborne and Coombe Springs and all these various things, and the various things done to really push him out of the picture. I've spoken before about Idries Shah, sort of cheating him out of Coombe Springs, and all the different things and the pressure that was brought to bear on Bennett to not make this happen. But strangely enough, he had brought over everything from England, and he had set it up in West Virginia. That's where Claymont was. And so America was the last heading of the Fourth Way Mystery School tradition that had come direct from Gurdjieff through to Bennett. So I feel like the anecdote that Bennett tells of Gurdjieff saying the mystery schools, what they do is that they spread these seeds. They're not so much interested in creating churches and foundations. They're spreading those seeds to spread up, and then they They come forward and they leave that and they withdraw and they let people and the culture pick up on what they've left behind and bring it out. So there's such a crucial need for us to do that. And the work of the Fourth Way has to be one of the most essential. So I'll read one more quote from this and we'll go to your questions. You're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're here on X Steganography episode 86. And this is the Deep State Lockdown versus the Fourth Way Mystery School, a crisis in human affairs. And Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good, very intense questions. I can't wait.
Okay, good. We're going to launch right into them. I'm going to read this because, again, it gets to what making a new world is all about. And Gurdjieff is telling Bennett now what that community bringing forward a new world could look like. It's very interesting. It may help to understand something of the significance of these ideas for the future of mankind if we try to visualize the effect on human relationships of a widespread realization that a man who does not struggle to attain a high density is no more than an animal, and indeed to be despised, which an animal is not. This is as far removed as possible from current ways of looking at people. They are valued for what they have, whether personal attraction or material possessions, for the position they occupy in life and for similar factors, which may have no connection at all with any true value. If once it is understood that the one true criterion which objectively decides the value of a man is his ability to struggle with himself, then only those who would be respected who showed by their lives that they had achieved some measure of success in that direction, their advice and help would be sought after as people who had come to some extent to be freed from their mechanicalness of ordinary existence, from slavery to external things, from inner weakness. Ambition, the desire for power, fame, admiration, and other motives which lead people to work and strive for positions of authority would be seen as defects and weaknesses unworthy of a true man. The world would seek for teachers rather than rulers, for those who could set an example rather than those who dominate and impress. The idea of a ruler who is himself the helpless slave of his own passions, with his own automatism, would be seen for what it is, a ludicrous travesty of a true master of men. A further inevitable consequence would be the disappearance of the mutual misvaluation among different castes or classes and between nations and races. Such misvaluation is only possible so long as artificial values dominate the mind of man. Wars of aggression and conquest, ideological and religious wars, all have their origin in false conceptions of what is important for man. It will be by no means obvious to you if I say that only an understanding of the twofold destiny of man can put an end to war. And then Bennett says, I propose, therefore, to finish by saying a little bit about Gurdjieff's teaching on the subject of war, its origin, and its possibility of its ceasing. That's a series of lectures by Bennett called Is There Life on Earth? About Gurdjieff. But it's very interesting to think of that value that society would put on people who had learned the ability not to be overstimulated by the outside world and were coming from that inner place. It's quite fascinating. Before we end this section, I have a clip from one of Bennett's lectures. And let's see if my new phone can do this now, because I got a new phone because I was having such troubles with the old one, as you can see. But I think this one will work. Olivia has the cruel summer overalls on here. So.
Got my farmer look going.
All right, here we go. This is J.G. Bennett in 1973, a year before he died, speaking on all the different things that we've been talking about here tonight. Here we go.
Another principle of change, and that is that change can only be proportionate to the amount of force which is put into it. But forceful change can only be effectual and positive if there is an equal response to it. That is, revolutionary and violent change can only be destructive. And therefore, even if an enormous force for change were at our disposal, we couldn't use it suddenly or immediately without producing destruction. And this principle of change is that one cannot change the present, but that there is the possibility of changing the future. And I'm going to speak in terms of these two principles. First of all, that we cannot change others, but there is a possibility of changing ourselves. We cannot change the present, but there is a possibility of changing the future.
That is something that's at the heart of the Gurdjieff work, which is it's about changing the future. And there's many things that go on where we want the immediate gratification of everything changing now. But really what the change is about changing that world that we're going into, about developing a new world. And also that we spend all this time concentrated, especially in political prognostication, of changing other people. You see it over and over again. People say, you know, you should respect my liberal point of view. And other people say, you're a crazy liberal, I'm a conservative. The truth is that we can't change other people. All we can do is provide some kind of counterpoint to the society that has gone off the rails. Some way of having people identify where a different magnetic center could be. So what Bennett is giving us is he's saying this is what the work is about. This is what he had arrived at after many decades. And with that, Miss Olivia, the fourth way is all yours.
Okay, whoa. I'm going to start. Daniel Natal said something that I'm going to throw to you as a question.
Yes.
He says, they organize, we don't. John Stuart Mill says that that's why small groups of men almost always lord over much larger groups. Organizational ability.
No question. Absolutely. And it's important, see, because when we're talking about organizing, you're talking about fixing a focus on a new situation. And it's the kind of hardening, the crystallizing of that idea that makes it into something in reality and doesn't let it escape. But I think organization is absolutely crucial, and it becomes the thing, you know, the consistency becomes the thing that separates us from something being, you know, good versus something being extraordinary, for example. But yeah, that's a good one. Yes.
Okay. G. Myers-Gilmer. Gurdjieff warned much against imaginary and mechanical thinking. Speaking with a fourth way perspective, how is it helpful to discern this chaos and control as coming from a few cabals instead of one?
Well, the cabal is one word I'd like to boot out of our entire lexicon when we talk about these things. So I think that when we talk about the deep state, we're talking about political forces. So the mystery schools, in speaking of those things, would understand them too. But for example, somebody like Professor Peter Dale Scott is a political researcher. He's not a mystery school teacher. So he understands them politically. And then from the mystery school side, they understand that the politics are involved, but they're looking at the kind of spiritual evolutionary track. So, but we have no doubt that anyone who investigates is going to find at the heart of those mystery schools, at the heart of the political process, there's a secret society mystery school element, that they have great knowledge of these things. So that's an important way, I think, for us to look at it. That the deep state has different elements is something I think people like Joseph Farrell and Peter Dale Scott, Professor Scott, have brought forward, which is that the deep state shouldn't be thought of as a monolith. You know, it's not a solid system. It's a series of things. It's like a weather system, is how Professor Scott developed it. It comes in, it swoops in, it's a hurricane, it causes all this devastation, it goes back to where it came from. It is a causal system. So it is important, I would say, to identify what it actually is. And so when we talk about the deep state, it is a series of things, and that it is not a monolith, and that the idea of the cabal is kind of a comic book version of what the real political process that we're up against is, and that we see that term overused quite a bit. Yes.
Josh Randall says, long-held cultural narratives are vanishing by the hour now, even the most baked-in ones. Not sure if it's exciting or scary. I'd say it's both exciting and scary. And we should embrace it. We are in a time of great change and upheaval.
Yes.
And this is what we came here for.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's also interesting, which is there's a way to do this, right? Because what they try to do is they whip something up in the media and they're like, oh my God, look at this Confederate statue. Let's take it down and let's have everyone have this feeling like they're righteous. Let's take down that terrible history. But then they create the circumstances where they'll be able to do that with the founding fathers, for example. So what they're doing is they're using one thing to get at another. So they'll throw out this cultural reference and then they'll use it to get at another. The idea of getting rid of the founding fathers, for example, is to get it in our heads that we don't have rights. And that, it's amazing how during this process it's taken so long for the Constitution to come up. When we've brought it up front and center, and in the media, they barely talked about the Bill of Rights or the infringement on the Constitution at all until really the governors were caught in such a crossfire from doing such egregious overreach. So it's very interesting that they want us to fall asleep to our origins. And the founding of the country around this idea of independence is definitely a mystery school principle. And it goes very deep into the warp and woof of what the country is. And if you can get rid of that, if you can call it homeland and just say it's under COG, instead of it's the United States under a constitution where you're free and independent, then it's a very huge difference. And they would love, the forces that are organizing these things around the response to the coronavirus would love that kind of power. And they'd love to make us forget by tearing down some of that history. Yes.
Najat Madri, was Gurdjieff a medium or a psychic?
Well, the way it works in those mystery schools is they develop you to such a point that you master all the arts. So, for example, there's this incredible story of, Bennett coming to Gurdjieff and saying, Gurdjieff said, what is it you want to learn? And he said, well, first of all, I want to learn how to astral project. And Gurdjieff says, well, okay, I'll show you this exercise. You sit down in this chair, you do this exercise, and you'll astral project. You'll leave your body. You'll have an out-of-body experience.
Do we know why he wanted that so badly? Why that was high on his list?
It's just one of those interesting Bennett kind of qualities. He was very curious, and so was Ouspensky. If you really look at Ouspensky's earlier work, it's so oriented around theosophy that you'd think, later he kind of goes against this psychic development track into like, hey, you have to work with the system. But really, he came out of theosophy. So I'll finish the story. So Bennett sits down in this chair and he does this technique, and he's working with Gurdjieff's thing, and he tries it for multiple hours, and he goes to him and he says, it's not working. And Gurdjieff says, go back. It's going to work. It's going to work. Just give it time. Like, don't be impatient. Get on with it. And so he sends him in there until he can do it. So he goes back into this room and he's working on projecting his body. And finally, he actually leaves his body and he's looking down at himself sitting in the chair. And then Gurdjieff opens the door to the room, looks at his body sitting there, and then looks up at his astral body sitting up there and goes like, huh. He gives him one of those smirks and walks out of the room like, I guess you learned it. So what happens in the mystery schools is all of these become techniques. You learn psychic ability. So even if you weren't a born psychic or a medium, you learn them as traits, as qualities. And so Gurdjieff is interesting in this sense, which is the most kind of fantastic thing that he's said to have done, which is after Ouspensky left, and he said, I'm not going to work with your system anymore, and I'm out of here. And he leaves on a train from Finland coming back to Moscow. And he says that Gurdjieff appears in the train, like manifestation, and talks to him and interacts with him, basically popping in out of thin air. Now, the kind of telepathic control that he had dealing with Ouspensky to be able to do that, and it's in Ouspensky's book, and Ouspensky is known for his great honesty and truth to detail. He doesn't like to talk about sensational things, but it's there in the book. And so the fact that Gurdjieff had the ability to astrally project himself physically represents a level, to believe the story, but represents a level of incredible psychic ability, for sure. So that's what you learn in those schools, apparently. Yes.
Winter says, many Orthodox and holy cardinals stated openly in the 1960s that every effort they made to reverse the course of evil was met with such a resistance they refer to it as, quote, the super force. What is the super force?
Oh, wow.
It's a great question.
I guess
that's a whole episode.
If they dealt with it, then they know. I do think that, I'm glad we have the Steiner work side by side as a contrast with Gurdjieff's work. They actually do have things in common. But I do feel that Steiner's reference to harmonic forces gives us an idea that there's a thing activated on the spiritual side, which has its counterpart on the physical plane. And that we're seeing this now through somehow technology, which I've always been very close to. I spent a decade as a tech editor. So there's nothing in me that is shy about technology. But I can tell you that the way it's being utilized, the harvesting of people, trying to track people and do these various technocratic terror things with, it strikes me that this force now is utilizing the fact that we've progressed in our technology far beyond progressing as individuals. And this is where the fourth way comes in, because if we can catch up and develop ourselves as individuals as a buffer against this exploding technological transhumanism, then which Fitz now calls subhumanism, which I think is a good way to put it, then we have a more level playing field. Yes.
Shamanist Anam Kara says, Araband, like with 5 exclamation points. This is the super force, right?
Yes.
So also,
I want to thank her for sending me such interesting things. Thank you for the interesting emails.
Cool. Also asking from Shamanist Anam Kara, sounds like Gurdjieff had some black magic being used against him, possibly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, this has come up quite a bit. Remember, they sent Aleister Crowley to stay at the Priory, and the story was that Gurdjieff threw him out. He could have done that on his own, I guess. But there is this idea of like Gurdjieff and Crowley meeting. It's like the super battle of all time. And it seems to me that with Gurdjieff's work, it was continually beset by issues. Just like Steiner's work, they burned the Goetheanum. The Nazis burned his Goetheanum and really set him back. With Gurdjieff, it's a mixed thing, because he comes forward and he tries to use Ouspensky to get his teaching out. And then at a certain point, he comes to loggerheads with Ouspensky, because he's challenging him on such a level that Ouspensky is like, you know what? I can take the system, I can take the things that you've brought from the mystery schools, but I can't deal with you, which we all know there's a kind of a liberation from the teacher thing, which can even be healthy, but it also represents a great difficulty. And some people have speculated that, some of the authors who have studied Gurdjieff, that he was never able, the way you rise in the mystery schools on different levels is to put someone on your level, and then you move up to the next level of enlightenment, basically. And they suggest that with people like Orage or Bennett or Ouspensky, that it was so difficult because they were predominantly they were great people. I mean, brave, but they were predominantly coming from an intellectual place. And Gurdjieff, by the nature of his circumstances, by the nature of his culture, had developed such a level of being, having to mountain climb to avoid soldiers during the Turkish-Armenian war, things like this, that he had developed such a level of being from being in those mystery schools that he was able to impart all the teachings, but he wasn't really able to elevate somebody up to the level where he was with it. But he may have also, one of the things that Ouspensky observed, because one of the things inside the system is that you have a wheel of eyes, and that these various random things that happen in the world around you move that wheel of eyes through this series of different personalities. And what Ouspensky said is that, Gurdjieff, what I discovered about Gurdjieff is that he has two eyes left. He's mastered the process to a point to only have two eyes left when we have multiple. But the two eyes that he had left one was very, very good and one was very, very bad. So this is an interesting thing about Gurdjieff. It's not very clear that the things that he brought forward from the mystery schools, at a certain point, he went off on his own. So it's not always clear at what point that break came about, and that they sent him out there to do this experiment. In a sense, he was sort of the maverick sage to bring this forward. So it's an interesting way to look at him, for sure. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here on X Series 86. We're going deep on the Fourth Way and Gurdjieff and his vision of a new world. Some of his students like Bennett and Ouspensky who helped to bring that forward, reminding us that in crisis, like what they've created with the coronavirus and the incredible unconstitutional lockdown and related to it, and no doubt the very kind of challenging future that we have in front of us with them trying to use this as a system to chip everyone, and a system to use fascist surveillance and to bring forward other things to hype us into an emotional mind control state. That these are the tools that were left behind by these schools. And the Fourth Way is one of those incredible tools if we can get our minds wrapped around what they were trying to teach us. And that's what we're about here tonight. And so let's keep rolling with the questions.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question from me.
Yes.
Okay. So I have experienced my own, and I'm sure this is just part of the collective unconscious now. Everybody's grieving right now. There's a lot of grief on the planet for what we've lost. Yeah. And we've lost a lot. It's valid grief. But we're stagnating in it. And so what does Gurdjieff say about emotional energy and about moving that emotional energy? He's not a warm and fuzzy type.
Well, it's interesting. One thing that is in the system of the Fourth Way is the complete suppression of negative thinking. I find this very interesting because, a lot of psychologists would say, well, you don't avoid something that's negative. It's not that the idea was to get you to look at the world as it was, but that he said one of the fundamental kind of functions of the human machine that's broken is that, he said, I can understand people imagining things that are too good, I can imagine them having fantasies of things being too good, but negative fantasies, this is a wrong use. And a lot of the work around the Gurdjieff stuff is the wrong use of our energies. So people unnecessarily arguing, people unnecessarily, kind of living in their emotions, being too hyper emotional. Not to say get out of your heart, because it's always important. This work has a tremendous amount of heart in it, including the fact of all the sacrifices that they made to be with Gurdjieff and to get the work out there, and the courageous things that he did. There's an incredible amount of heart in it. But I think that the way I would answer that is they talk a lot about it takes a tremendous amount of energy to evolve and evolve consciously. and that there's only so much evolution that will take place on its own. You'll learn something all the time from doing a particular thing. That's one kind of evolution that will take place. But there's the possibility for heightened evolution to take place within you, that you have the ability to develop yourself to the fullest amount of your potential. It was JFK said, the development of your powers along the lines of excellence. Mm-hmm. You have that within you. And that it requires a tremendous amount of energy. So therefore, we need to save our energy. For example, people who want to drain you online on Twitter, for example, he would look at that as the most idiotic activity, And he often said that people who were driving would go into these, rages and things like that. They were wasting tremendous energy. And he said, what I want you to do is imagine that when you get angry and sort of yell at somebody, that in your machine, which is your body and your mind, imagine it as a great explosion inside a factory. And it takes days for them to repair where that explosion took place and get back to working properly. So the idea of saving that energy, of not over-identifying, of not taking the bait, is central in the Gurdjieff system, because you need that energy in order to be able to psychologically progress consciously. So
what are the techniques that are recommended?
Well, they're
to transmute that energy.
It is self-remembering is the crucial one, mm-hmm. Which is if you can remember yourself while being aware of what's happening around you. And the way that they drew it, I always thought was interesting, because it was an arrow pointing out and then an arrow pointing toward you. So that it was kind of a walking meditation in a sense that you're aware of yourself and the outside world. So that's one of the methods. There's so many methods inside the Gurdjieff work. I mean, In Search of the Miraculous has the great majority of that. And I think that fundamentally it is not overreacting, mm-hmm. and not, a lot of people don't feel alive until they're yelling at somebody else, right? And then there are other people who can't connect with that at all. So it is a balance of utilizing these things. But there's a tremendous amount in the Gurdjieff work of, which really applies in the political world, because in the political side, and I've experienced this just reporting on it for so many years, that people will always come at you and say, well, I like so-and-so, but did you know that at one point he endorsed, some political party that I don't like, and it just goes round and round and round. So opinions are one thing, but getting to agreements is something else. Remember that the top thing, not in the Gurdjieff system, although it's deeply embedded in it, but in Casey's work, the Search for God groups, they were like, what's the first principle? What do we need to learn first? And they all thought it would be like, you need to open your third eye, or you need to ascend through your chakras or something like that. And he said the first rule was cooperation. Think about that. How often do we see people cooperating? This is very interesting to me. Okay, go for it.
Okay, so Cheryl Bumgarner,
yes.
Do you have to be invited to attend a mystery school? How does that work?
You could be invited to a mystery school, yeah. I think that the way that I would look at mystery schools really is, because they are mystery schools, that you can't find them just by looking them up online. It doesn't exist that way. So the way I've described it and the way I understand the process is this. You have the outer circle, which is basically study groups, public study groups. That's the outer circle. And that's just becoming interested in somebody's work. So if you could find that in work relating to the Golden Dawn or Gurdjieff or Theosophy, there's always study groups available. Then there's private study groups, which go a level deeper, and you might work with somebody who's more experienced at it. Deeper in that process, there's something called arcane schools. And arcane schools transmit information exactly as it was written down, and they maintain it. They don't change it, they don't update it, they don't do anything. So if you had a Knights Templar course that existed in 1300, an arcane school around that would be exactly like that. And so arcane schools existed, and it's a great deal of knowledge that could be maintained from that. So, for example, Gnostic mystery schools are very much in this vein. Then the next schools are called lesser schools. It's a very interesting title. It's just, they know some things that the main mystery schools understand, but the lesser schools are the developments for the initiates. So in the mystery schools are actual initiates and that great teaching. So there are levels to these things fundamentally. I would say what we have in the majority of cases in things that we know now as mystery schools would be public study groups and then deeper private study groups. Those are the two things that you run across the most in everyday life. I do think it's interesting the way that people from mystery schools can show up, however. And they'll never show up saying like, here, join my $333 class and and that they're Edgar Casey reincarnated or anything like that. It's not the way that they operate. Okay.
Charles Marlowe, did Gurdjieff like cats?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
We know Ouspensky loved cats,
Ouspensky, right? If you look through his work, he understood that, and he felt that cats had incredible knowledge. But he, was the equivalent of a crazy cat lady at the end because he had something like 20 cats, and he would drive around with his cats, which I think is very interesting.
Pretty incredible. Just that they would allow that. It's amazing.
He did an interesting thing. Ouspensky, who is one of the greatest thinkers, I think, in his books, Tertium Organum and New Model of the Universe. And he wrote novels, too. He wrote The Strange Life of Ivan Ossikin, which is where that whole Groundhog Day recurrence thing comes from. And that is really Groundhog Day in its era. This guy wakes up and he keeps making the same mistakes in this lifetime that keep leading him to the point where he's just about to commit suicide. And during one of those lives, he meets a magician who says, you can do this a little bit differently. And actually, he goes to the magician and he says, I want to do my life differently. Can you help me do it? And he said, I can send you back to live your life exactly as it was, but you won't be able to change anything. So he says, nonsense, send me back there. I'll change everything. And every time he gets into the situations, he makes the same mistakes. So it's very fascinating. But the idea of eternal recurrence was deep in Ouspensky's way of thinking. And so what he was doing at the end of his life was driving around London and outside of London, trying to imprint the impressions on it. So when he came back, and his reincarnation, he thought was coming back to the beginning of his life. This is eternal recurrence. You come back into that life again and again until you learn that lesson. Usually the time that you hear about eternal recurrence is when that's the last go round of that eternal recurrence. But he also said there were challenges in it, like when he would come back, in writing the literature about it, he would say that there were people who were there in some recurrences that weren't there in others, and that their lives had started to go down or that they had moved on. So it's a very interesting system, eternal recurrence. But I found it fascinating that he had this sense his whole life. It was kind of like lifelong deja vu. Everything that happened, including meeting Gurdjieff, all the things that happened to him. The strange prank that he played at college that got him thrown out of school and made his life miserable. The fact of his sister being taken as a political prisoner. All these strange chapters in his life, he had that sense of deja vu every time they happened. So Ouspensky certainly had a kind of a psychic, mystical feeling about him. I'm going to tell you something very unusual about Ouspensky, which is that there's a Casey reading from 1942, which is incredibly thoughtful and philosophical and sounds a lot like the Fourth Way stuff. And then at the end of it, he says, this is Ouspensky giving this dissertation. So basically, Casey is channeling Ouspensky, okay. But Ouspensky was still alive. He's channeling him while he's alive.
That's crazy.
Think about that. And of course, the incredibly wild thing that Casey said when they asked him to look into Ouspensky and his lives, and he was going over his lives, and he said, oh, yes, the keeper of the temple records in the mount, 7th year, 7th month, 7th day, 7777. Figure that one out. Who was Ouspensky, really? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're going deep now on the Fourth Way, and we're taking your questions. I want to recommend that you go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for our newsletter, keep up to date with us, with everything that's going on. You just never know the ability we're going to have to reach out to you through social media. But if you're on that newsletter list, it's easy because we have that direct pipeline. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions, and then we'll shut it down.
I really want to ask this question. Michael Grum-Bovin, did Gurdjieff recognize the Great White Brotherhood?
Well, it's interesting because the Great White Brotherhood is the foundation school of the mystery schools. And so figures like Steiner and like Casey and like Theosophy refer to this Great White Brotherhood. That's where the masters come out of. And the white part is just the aura. It has nothing to do with them being white or anything. But in Gurdjieff's tradition and his dealing with the mystery schools, talking about the deepest level of those schools, it sounds like he is describing the White Brotherhood, but he does not use the terminology. And he always talks about the great initiates or, these great masters, masters of the Sarmung Brotherhood, masters of the Essene School. He, in his system, he may actually discuss that terminology, but in his system, it's not one of the things that he brings in. But there's no question that the mystery school teachings, the core of the fundamental understanding around the mystery schools, is that the Great White Brotherhood is where Saint Germain and all of these other masters come from, including Christ. Yes.
Care for Bunny's Not. Does DJ think Gurdjieff's Fourth Way gets you through the greater guardian of the threshold or just the first?
That's good. That's deep stuff.
Somebody's showing off there.
The guardian of the threshold, when you are moving into this work, there's a certain level that you get to where, in Steiner's terminology, it reflects back everything at you and it reflects all your fears. And so it's a very difficult step to get past into the spiritual world. And so I would think that the tools, what's great about the tools of the Fourth Way is they work on multiple things at once. So this is one of the things that Gurdjieff said in relation to other systems and why he felt that they weren't as efficient for humanity. He thought that theosophy worked basically developing a person's sense of mysticism. So they would be in touch with mystical ideas. They would grow from that. But it took a lot away from them physically. It didn't really concentrate much on what they would do physically. And there's such a physical aspect to Gurdjieff's work that is, a lot of it is conceptual, of course, but he was always about getting in touch with the body, doing things. People were always putting up wallpaper, shoveling ditches. Shoveling ditches, gardening. It's a very tactile, physical work. I remember when I worked with the Gurdjieff group to see what they were doing. They had me making chutney, which is something I had never done before.
And you cut yourself.
That's true. I did.
Because
so that's probably part of the lesson.
You weren't paying attention.
Exactly. Once you lose the attention, it's over. But I do feel that we could be looking at something where the Gurdjieff impulse had to be injected into mystery school understanding because the understanding was getting projected out there. And how many times do we meet people who have great intentions, but they're like, I am Saint Germain, or I'm walking with Saint Germain, and it's not that they wouldn't be, but I think the point is that it needs to be integrated. Just like the thing about when somebody says, I'm Edgar Cayce, it doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter. It would be nice to have a famous past life or whatever, but you developing your single focus so that you could express the tools of your soul is a mental, physical, spiritual, emotional experience. That's why a school that can work on all of those at once is probably superior to one that just develops your intellect or one that just develops your psychic senses on their own, and it's funny, we have Gigi Young out here tonight. Gigi Young can really explain this very well because she deals with that, in her work. She can go deep on the spiritual side, but she understands the foundation, the ground, how important it is to be grounded. And then I don't know if she's out there tonight, but someone like Deborah Blair can tell us, having studied on the Young side, but also knowing meditation and things like that, she can give us that deeper psycho-spiritual aspect. So it's very interesting ways for looking at this, and I actually feel like they're both very qualified to talk about that realm much better than I would be. Yes.
I'd like to share just a quick story.
Yeah.
Okay, so you know this story. Many years ago, I had a dream experience. It wasn't a dream; it was something other. So I'll never forget it. And I was, I'll make it quick. I realized I was dead in the dream, and I turned to what were basically caretaker angels. And I said, knowing that I would have to reincarnate, how do I come back psychic? And they said, discipline and attunement. And
that's interesting.
Those are words that have haunted me ever since. Discipline. I'm not good at either.
Yes.
But I understand, I've been thinking about it now amidst the challenges that we're all facing, is that really it always comes down to those two things: attunement with higher forces, with your higher self, with your guides and angels, and the discipline to follow the guidance in real time in your life.
That's incredible. And that whole aspect of people getting information from angels under difficult situations or seeing angels, I always find is an incredible, it's an incredible crossover from that world into this one. And when people have those experiences, it's remarkable and it's very personal for them. And it is something that we can all kind of gain this great wisdom from hearing those stories. But the dreams in particular, I always recommend people keep a diary of their dreams, because the tremendous symbols that are coming forward, whether it's from a deeper part of your psyche or from, it's interesting in the Gurdjieff work, he says that there's two things that people in the school are always trying to get at: the higher emotional and the higher intellectual centers. And Ouspensky decided, after working for years and years on this, that the thing that was missing, the tool that Gurdjieff hadn't given, was to be able to access the language of the higher emotional center. He thought he had given them all the other pieces of the puzzle. And the higher emotional center, according to Gurdjieff, its language is symbol. So I feel like in dreams, we get a lot of that unconscious symbol. So we're working somehow with that higher emotional center. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 86. We're going to take 2 more questions and we're done. What a great crowd here tonight, going deep. And I know that we started with the political thing and we did a big mystical switch on you, but that's the way the X Series rolls. We know that these things are
we're multidimensional beings.
They're deeply intertwined, for sure. But thank you so much for your great questions. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter, and make sure that you're counted in that sense, because we're going to need that direct pipeline. If the censorship wheel takes off any faster than it already is while you're there, get on board and sign up with us. We made it very affordable for you to join, and it's something where you can get behind the work that we're doing on this program and really bring something special forward. for everyone, which we're going to be doing here in April and May, some remarkable shows coming forward that you're not going to want to miss. Okay. Miss Olivia, the final two.
Okay, I got them.
Two, you got it.
Marduk's the 12th. How do we discern the real from the catfish guru? I want to say we watched a lot of guru stuff this week, including Holy Hell. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Well, here's an interesting thing. There have always been, one of the first cults that I studied was Rajneesh. And it's very interesting what happens in those situations. People really lay down their lives for this idea or this community or group. And this whole thing around centering it around a guru. And this was a big crossover from Eastern life, because that's what they did in the East. When that got imported here, we found people very wrapped up in this. But then you get unscrupulous guys at the top, doing things like stashing weapons and selling drugs. So, but what I think is important when we look at these different groups is you can always, if a lot of it is about themselves, and if a lot of it is about who they are, then that's very different. But if a lot of it is about, that they're giving this kind of teaching out, then, it all comes down to how selfless the whole exercise is and how much value you find in it. And sometimes people are so dynamic that they can find value in situations that aren't so good. But, if somebody's making great claims about being reincarnated somebody, or if they're making bad predictions or whatever, just get out of there. And yourself as the guru, I think, is fine. In the Fourth Way groups and in the Fourth Way work, what happens is you find there are basically there's an emphasis around a group coming together around principles, and that creates a third force. So there's the group, there's the teaching, and then when they interact, there's a third force. That type of setup, I think, can be very valuable. And putting too much on a guru, a lot of the things that we learned from Steiner's work was that we're kind of coming out of that somebody doing it for us. And this is what Theosophy had emphasized so much about the masters. And it's good to know that they're there working in the background, but ultimately it's up to us to do it. And so, working with your own, I would say with your inner guru is a good way to do it. But in terms of how do you sift the wheat from the chaff, very often, I can tell you when it comes to the alternative media and things like that, the work that I've thrown out is work that claims that there's a cabal, Fulford, Wilcock, that type of stuff. For me, it's junk. So I know it because their signature is always to get you hyped into a thing. There's going to be mass arrests. There's going to be this. Those are the types of cults that we see very often in this space. When you go into the spiritual side, the same types of principles exist. If they're trying to kind of rope you in as opposed to offer you something, then that's kind of a good way, I think, to figure out the good work and something that will resonate with you versus people who would take advantage of you.
I think I just wanted to add that so much of it has to do with your own intention. And if you want shortcuts, you're going to get screwed, whether it's drugs or a guru or whatever. It's it's a hard slog. There's a lot of stuff. It's lonely. It's messy,
yes.
The spiritual path. And, like when we're watching Holy Hell, if you're joining up with them because you're having a ball, you're having a great time, there's going to be a fall at the end of it, right?
Well, we've seen, it's interesting. I think people have a predisposition to work with each other. And if they can work with each other around interesting, good principles, like what the mystery schools have laid out, I think there's fantastic possibilities that can happen there. And, the situations are pretty individual. All right, what else you got?
Okay, so this is just a crazy question,
yes.
But okay, off topic, BH. DJ, Are you into remote viewing? The Farsight team just viewed Zeus, and it seems he was an alien.
That doesn't surprise me.
I know. Well, there's that great Star Trek episode. Is Deep State still alien at its source? Your thoughts?
It doesn't have to be. I mean, I think that people can become so corrupt with power that they become alienated from humanity. And so you could look at it like that. In terms of, there's a great deal of history from the Bible, different Western traditions that were hidden, like the books of Enoch, etc., that really do suggest there's a crossover with interstellar situations and civilizations visiting here and setting things up. Those stories go all the way back to Nephilim and all the rest of it. And I think that they are important. Look, in the alternative space, we were Sumerianed to death, right? Everything was about, hey, the Sumerian Anunnaki made slaves of everybody to make gold, and Zecharia Sitchin, they really rammed this down. That was really tough to deal with and to take. However, now that the dust has settled on that and not everybody is jumping away on it, there's something legitimate about looking back and saying the first interaction, whether it's, in the mystery schools, you've got us interacting with all kinds of different entities in Atlantean times and Egyptian times. And so that force of beings that we interact with mutates and changes and grows as we grow culturally. So I think it's possible that you could easily attribute some of these things to an off-world influence.
Did Gurdjieff ever mention anything about?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Hey, look, Beelzebub's tales to his grandson is all about Beelzebub coming here in a spaceship and talking to him about Earth from looking at it from another planet. So yeah, he played with the science fiction idea.
I mean, I always, I'm an extremely practical person.
Yes.
My feeling is, I don't have the power to know one way or the other about human origins, about the royal family, etc. I'm always asking myself, what can I do now? What is the best that I can do now?
Sure.
Part of that is personal for me and my soul growth, and part of it is for all of us. What is the best we can do now? So I'm going to throw that to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Under these circumstances, we're about to open the country back up again. What is the best vision that we can have now?
Well, it's interesting. I think we've talked about this building a new world. I want to say this to go back on the UFO file, though, because the things that I said shouldn't be misconstrued. Because the UFO file exists, and we've had that interaction with off-world civilizations. That's, for me, not in question. There's been too many experiences over too long an expanse of time. The idea of, forces that come, civilizations that are off-world, is inherent in the X series work that we do. It's just that when you directly relate that type of visitation to aliens control the deep state, then it's a little harder to prove. But I think, it shouldn't be misunderstood, though, because the UFO file is absolutely something that is real. There's so many stories about crashes. There's so many stories about beings. It's just too much. And unsolicited most of the time, and so many cover-ups relating to it. So the UFO file is a fantastic mystery for the era and the age that we're in. But in terms of advice of how we can deal with things now, look, the momentum, just to speak about recent events, of things opening up is exactly what we needed and what we were looking for. And we need to create, with that momentum, getting rid of the lockdowns, getting rid of the unconstitutional activity, and go back to being free people trying to develop a better system, and maybe take a deep look at this and how it shows, and it drops the mask on these forces that are trying to, turn us into a technocratic, techno-fascist civilization, which we are not. It's never going to fly. So the pushback on them is on, and they have overreached, And I think in this case that, we're looking at a situation that we can really learn and grow from. And we need to keep up tremendous pressure on them to open things up and to return the country back to traditional constitutional rule, and to make sure that we have a free and fair election in November, and none of these hijinks trying to prevent that from happening because they don't like the current occupant in the White House. If they can legitimately run a good campaign with a good candidate and get rid of them, then fine. But using the CIA to do it isn't going to fly. And I think so on our side, the message has to be clear. And I think, just to add this on, the making of a new world and what the mystery schools were there for, the Gurdjieff work, those people and the foundation that they left for us, in search of the miraculous, knowledge of higher worlds, there is a river. These things are documents along the way to help us get to that next place, to really develop into that civilization, which, Steiner calls New Jupiter. And on the Gurdjieff level and the Gurdjieff work, it is simply taking advantage of the opportunities for the window of time that they exist and really moving to change the culture. And so he did call it building a new world. That's the way I like to look at it. And I think that's within our grasp, and we can use this incredible tense situation the same way that they used the blocks and the distraction of the Russian Revolution and World War I and World War II and the Depression to really, use all of our ingenuity and resources to get to a better place. I think we can do that through the crisis for sure. And with that, Miss Olivia, I guess that's just about it. I wanted to shout out, you shout out to a few people.
Actually, I'm trying to remember. I wanted to say one last thing, so you give some shout outs.
No, super chatters.
Okay. Eurythmia's Fun.
Yes.
Peggy C.
Okay.
Derek Vigil. Josh Randall. PRBR.
Yes.
Tyler Thompson. Jody Z. There's a long list. Charles Marlowe. Mermaid Moxie. Callum Ship. Pinhas Lavon. Carol Crumlish, a cult fan. Rasterman the Seer. B. Brax. Gary Cates. Brian Bradley. Erie A. Joseph Fabry, Brad Bryant, Susan Dewar, G. Myers-Gilmer, Destination Lyra, Nacreus 3.7, Neurosurgery Highland, Matt M., Roosevelt Media News, and Sidvich. And if I forgot anybody, I'm so sorry, but thank you so much.
That's incredible. Thank you so much for your support of the program, and for all our supporters and subscribers. We appreciate it.
Oh, I know what I
wanted to say. A great deal. Yes.
Okay. So people are asking me what I was working on last week. So I am not ready to put that out there yet. What I did find out through Molly McCord and other astrologers is that basically all of us are in a planning stage. We're rich with ideas, but we have a new moon coming up on April 22nd, and that's a better time to commit to something. So right now we should sort of jot down all our options and then commit. It's too early to commit right now.
Well, it's in development.
Yes.
It's in development. Absolutely. Well, apparently we have some incredible astrology going on right now, because what we're looking at when you look out at that night sky is this Atlas is out there. And this is a very interesting situation with that comet. And we've heard things of it breaking up and all the rest of it, but it's visible in the night sky, which tells me a lot, actually. And so we're going to be covering some very interesting astronomical activity coming up. Everyone, we will see you next week. I want to do a couple of quick shout outs to everyone out there. Wayne Peak, it's great to see you. And Gigi Young, of course, fantastic. Breach, excellent to see you. Ian Potter, fantastic. I know Carly from Dimensions and Beyond was out there. Gushara, fantastic. Carol Crumlish, thank you so much. Bethany Green, fantastic to see everyone. I know Kate was out there. It's great to see you. And Carl Young, of course, honored guest. Johan Wolf, thank you very much for being here. We will see you all next Friday at 8 o'clock. And with everything that's been happening, of course, you might see a show between now and then. And we have some very exciting interviews as well coming up for you. So thank you so much for joining us. And remember, in terms of the fourth way, that great line from the Greek mystery schools, which is know thyself, is at the very heart of that effort. So with that,
can you end on a quote about worry?
Well, you've got that.
Is it why worry when you can pray?
Oh, that's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
That's a
and
fantastic
I'd say, why
one.
worry when you can plan? Right now, we should be planning. We're powerful. You know, I often lose my power thinking about these people and how powerful they are. And I know other people do too. But that is no way to live. You know, we have to just express the power that we have every day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, you know, it's amazing because we have great people inside the ideas room who give us that inspiration very often. And so you guys are a great part of this too. I see Aether out there. It's great to see you. And thanks for joining us. We will see you next Friday, and have a great night. You know, it says end broadcast, but you know, it never really ends.
Thanks so much, everybody.
What about the astrology this weekend?
I'll have to check on that.
There must be something going on.
I'm sure there is.